No matter what I do, I'm always late. But if I'm on time, it doesn't matter. Hmm. Hey there, everyone. Racial rebellions of the 60s. Come on in, retweet it. We're going hard tonight. We're going to be doing this for a couple of hours. There are four, and then there's two, then there's one. Hey, Brother Mark. I have a new song, Brother Mark. I'm not going to share it yet. Uh, okay. Hold on. There you go. All right. Okay. I do have a new song. I have a new song. Come on in, guys. Let's see if we can get this done started in the next few minutes. Just trying to get myself together. Uh, I think I am going to put this up on Twitter. uh, okay. Okay. Yeah, it's on all channels. All channels. Let me see. Make certain that we're good here. And get that out the way. And I just have all of these phenomenal texts. And I was thinking of doing an oldie but a goodie first. An oldie but a goodie. And I had the Kerner Commission study. I think I'm going to read some of it. Let me see, I'm about to go live on one of my Twitter accounts. And good. Here we are. And I'm about to jump into form, retweet this, like it, share it. We are not begging for an audience, but we definitely have some worthwhile stuff. I've never shared this book with people. I might read something from it just to lead into it. And I got this other one. I hope you guys liked a little bit of stuff I did from lynching. I feel like doing a little bit of this David Walker as we go through. And yeah, I got all my stuff stacked up here. Wonderful. We have a quorum. We got our quorum. As many people is going to do this. Let me see what's a good place to start in here. see. See if this the index will help me with this. It may not. I want you to hear from this. Mhm. Okay, I love this. Here we go. Hey, Sister Star. Hey, everybody. Okay, good. Welcome to the Angry Black Men's Book Club. I am your host and your semi-literate servant. Uh, I'm none other than Dr. Randy Short. Pardon my stain on my shirt. You may not see it. Uh, I want to welcome everybody. I love this. I'm in chapter 3 of this wonderful um, mhm, mm, 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 mm. Mm. I'm looking. Oh, this is so wild. Okay, I love this. I think this is the best thing. Chapter 3. Let's see what. Okay, you might even find this is wild. Hmm. Hold on. I'm trying to see where I want to put this. I'm I'm just looking to a reprint of a book I'm gonna tell you about in a minute. Mhm. Okay, so it's right up in here. 3. Okay. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. 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 3 and 4. 3 and 4. I may skip through this, but 3 and 4. All right. Oh, it's a minute after. Okay. Hey guys, I'm gonna kick this off because some of my favorite people are in law, the law field, and this is a reprint of a book from the 1800s called A Sketch of the Laws Relating to Slavery in Several States of the United States of America by George McDowell Stroud. And when you hear some of this, you're going to find how similar some of the things that were for slaves are for us today. I'm correct, it's 1827. And I'm going to read some of this and I'm going to go through maybe chapters here and there because you can't always tell it all. But this is chapter 3 from Stroud's. I'm going to read some of this. And this is other conditions of the slave considered as a member of civil society. Uh, to speak of a slave as a member of civil society may by some be regarded as a solecism. Such a condition, however, is recognized by the law of the slaveholding states. To what extent and for what purpose it is recognized will be sufficiently manifested in the course of this chapter, which, for the sake of perspicuity, will be arranged and examined under the following titles. Number 1, a slave cannot witness against a white person either in civil or criminal cause. let me just say to you, we're seeing this right now before the trial starts for uh, what's that kid's name? Carmelo Anthony. Number two, he cannot be party in a civil suit. You saw this happen with the high tech social media people. I think Google. Blacks were excluded. Benefits of education are withheld from the slave. We have inferior education to this day. They're calling everything DEI and destroying it. The means for moral and religious instruction are not granted to the slave. On the contrary, the efforts of the humane and charitable to supply these wants are discontinued by law. What they now do is you can't get federal money if the churches do too much to stand up for black folk. 5. Submission is required of the slave, not to the will of his master only, but to that of all other white persons. The penal code for Carmelo, he's supposed to do what those white boys said because he's black. A lot of y'all don't realize this stuff carries over. This is still part of our culture and this society. Do what white folks say if you want things to work out for you. If you don't do what they say, you could have a problem. They told him to move, and he didn't move. And even though they weren't teachers and had no authority, and in an official sense, they were white, he stabbed them, one of them. And that's sort of back in the day, that would have been his death. 6. Penal codes of slaveholding states bear much more severely upon slaves than upon white persons. 7. Slaves are prosecuted and tried upon criminal accusation as a manner inconsistent with the rights of humanity. Let's repeat that one. Slaves are prosecuted and tried upon criminal accusation in a manner inconsistent with the rights of humanity. In other words, the human rights of people like now, the Karens and people that accuse and say stuff and the police come, that's from slavery. That happens right now. We live it today. We're still living this in a new manifestation, or at least a modified. Number 1, a slave cannot be a witness against a white person, either in a civil or criminal cause. I have on occasion very frequently to advert this subject as a cause of the greatest evils of slavery. Acts of assembly apparently intended to give protection to the slave from the master's cruelty have been adduced and yet shown to be altogether nugatory. And the consequence of the rule of law, which forms of this title of this section, in truth, in our slaveholding states, this exclusion is not confined to the evidence of slaves, but natives of Africa and their descendants, whatever may be the shade of their complexion, whether bond or free, are under the like degrading disability. In a few of the slaveholding states, the rule derives its authority from custom. I always taught you about custom and law. It's a custom to let white folk beat your ass. Back in the slavery days, as it said here, submission was required of the slave, and not to the will of his master only, but to that of all other white people. That's been the custom where a white person could correct you, could beat you. This was the norm. It was certainly the norm when I was a child. That's from slavery. And in fact, what typically happened back then is a black parent would beat their child in front of white people to show their submission. It happened to me once or twice. Custom. And others, legislatures have sanctioned it and expressed enactment. In Virginia, there's an act of the assembly in these words: any Negro or mulatto, bond or free, shall be a good witness and please with the Commonwealth for and against Negroes or mulattoes, bond or free, and civil pleas where free Negroes or mulattoes alone shall be parties, and in no other cases whatsoever. Such being the law, it requires no extraordinary perspicacity to pronounce that the effects must be the most injurious to the unhappy victims of slavery. It places a slave who is seldom within view of more than one white person at a time entirely at the mercy of this individual without regard to his fitness for the exercise of power, whether his temper be mild and merciful or fierce and vindictive. A white man may with impunity, if no other white be present, torture, maim, and even murder his slave in the midst of any number of Negroes and mulattoes, having absolute dominion over his slave. The master, his delegate, if disposed to commit illegal violence upon him, may easily remove him to a spot safe from the observation of a competent witness. Indeed, it is probable few white persons ordinarily reside upon the same plantation, since I find in most slaveholding states, owners of slaves are compelled by a considerable penalty to keep at least one white man on each plantation to which a certain number of slaves is attached, a law which would not have been necessary unless the contrary practice was prevalent. Plain and conclusive at this reasoning must be in the mind of any candid person. I think it best, nevertheless, to corroborate it by direct testimony of several distinguished persons whose means of information entitle them to speak with authority. Sir William Young, then governor of Tobago, and an advocate for slavery, thus expressed himself in 1811. Instances of bad treatment and cruelty and of unjust and immoderate punishment of slaves I think occur exclusively within the narrow trading of the household circle of unattached slaves, and I am sorry to say, have frequently been reported to me with circumstances of atrocity to be believed, though for some reason, which I shall not give, not be proved against the lower white or colored people domineering over from 2 to 10 or more wretched beings, their slaves. In such cases, what protection by law have the slaves against the abuse of power over them by Europeans or other free people? I think the slaves have no protection. In this, I doubt that not every other island there are laws for the protection of slaves and good ones, but circumstances in the administration of whatever law render it a dead letter. When the intervention of the law, he continues, is most required, it will have the least effect, as in cases where a vindictive and cruel master has care to commit the most atrocious cruelties, even to murder his slave, no free person being present to witness the act. There appears to me a radical defect in the administration of justice throughout the West Indies. In whatever case the wrongs done to the slave are under consideration, or rather, that justice cannot in truth be administered, controlled as it is by the law of evidence, which covers the most guilty European with impunity, provided that when having criminal intent, he is cautious not to commit the crime in the presence of free witnesses. I should consider it inconsistent with the respect and deference I bear the sagacity and wisdom of the august body for which this report is framed, to idly enlarge it with the enumeration of humane laws for the protection of slaves, all rendered nugatory by the condition of evidence required in their administration. And let me see. See for the extract of this from Sir William Young report, Stephen's West Indian Slavery. Mr. Stephen has collected the statements of many other holding official stations in the British West India colonies, all concurring in relationship to this one point, the inefficacy of all laws made for the protection of slaves and the consequence of the rejection of the testimony of slaves. I avail myself of an additional citation from this source. The Chief Justice of the Island of St. Vincent gives the following answer to the parliamentary inquiries proposed to him in the year 1791. The only instances in which Their slave persons appear to be protected by the letter of the law are in cases of murder, dismemberment, and mutilation. And in these cases, as the evidence of slaves is never admitted against the white man, the difficulty of establishing the facts is so great that white men are in a manner put beyond the reach of the law. I subjoin a further proof, not that I consider the present topic difficult of explanation, but because what I now adduce is borrowed from the authentic records of slaveholding state of our own country. The Negro Act of South Carolina contains the following preamble in one of its sections. Whereas by reason of the extent and distance of the plantations in this province, the inhabitants are far removed from each other, and many cruelties may be committed on slaves, because no white person may be present to give evidence of the same. After such admissions of the evils of this law, we are naturally induced to inquire what reasons have led to its adoption, especially what can justify its continuance. It is alleged by its advocates that it is coeval in the institution of slavery, and they add, moreover, as if the circumstance were of great moment, that slavery has existed since the time of Noah. The servitude under some form is of a very remote antiquity. There can be no doubt, but it cannot be established, it is believed, by proofs at all worthy of reliance, that the rejection of the testimony of the slave has always been a concomitant evil. If indeed it could be shown that such had in all ages been the misfortune of the oppressed, it would not surely on that account carry conviction of the justice or of the rejection to the mind of anyone who rightly weighs the claim of humanity, and who believes that to do, justify, love, and mercy are the duties of inflexible and perpetual obligation. The lineage, this is English slavery, friends, as it existed in England, furnishes no authority for the universal application of this rule. A villain, you get the word villain from English slaves, people. A villain was a good witness in civil cases against anyone except his lord, and he might prosecute his lord in the king's name if violence done to this person. It is right to presume in such a case he must have been admitted as a witness against him also. And without doubt, criminal cases generally, there is no exception of a witness that he was a villain or a bondsman. We must have recourse in the civil law for its profitable origin. The general rule was that certain laws, certainly was, that a slave could not be a witness, though there were some exceptions to it, found in reason and policy for men of that condition, might be examined when the welfare of the state in cases of weight and difficulty required such a departure from the general principles of when other evidence was unattainable. This latter exception, it is obvious, destroys the rule if we are to understand that by it a slave might be examined and the defect of other proof for the inculpation of any offender against the laws, and such I suppose by the true meaning, since the slaves might always induce an investigation by flying the statute of princes. A privilege would be of little value unless the slave could be examined as a witness against his injurer, and if admissible in his own case with much more propriety, could be heard on behalf of third persons where feelings of interest would not operate bias against him. It may safely be averred, I believe, that the rule of this evidence, to the extent to which it obtains in our slaveholding states, cannot challenge for its support the authority of any country, either ancient or modern. For it must not be forgotten that it is not evidence of slaves only which is rejected by it. It applies equally to colored persons, or rather to the descendants of Africans, as well as those who are free as those who are slaves. This being the case, I shall briefly discuss the propriety of it as a whole compass. What do you guys think? So you couldn't even tell anybody, and it didn't matter, and therefore people had the right to kill based on how they felt like it. I'm not going to do all of this. But I love this. And I'm looking at this thing. This is America. Where people say that, let me add this. I'm going to skip down here. I'm in number 2 now. A slave cannot be a party to a civil suit. Um, Let me read this. The oldest law of this description appears to have been adopted by South Carolina in the year 1740. It begins with what has already extracted, but which, for the sake of perspicuity, it will be proper to repeat, be enacted all Negroes, Indians, free Indians in amity with this government, and Negroes and mulattoes and mestizos now free accepted. I want to go back and explain that to you again, that Negroes, Indians, free Indians in amity with the government, Indians at peace with the government, and Negroes, and mulattoes, and mestizos now free, accepted, meaning that all these different types of people that folks say they are, that were Aboriginal, these people used to recognize that in the law, and then all of a sudden everybody became black. Not that I knock it, I prefer the consolidation, but they recognize Indians and mix between Indian and black, white and different people, but then all of a sudden they did that. That's in the laws, people. So for folks who say you don't have any Indian ancestry, it's a lie. Okay. Mulattoes and mestizos who are now or shall hereafter be in this province, all their issue and offspring born or to be born, shall be, and they are hereby declared, and to be, and for remain forever, hereafter, absolute slaves, and shall follow the condition of the mother, etc., etc., provided that any Negro, Indian, mulatto, or mestizo claim his or her freedom, it shall and may be lawful for such Negro, Indian, mulatto, or mestizo, or any person or persons whatsoever on his or her behalf apply to the judges of His Majesty's Court of Common Pleas by petition or motion, either during or sitting in the court, or before any of the justices of the same court at any time in vacation, and the said court of any of the justices thereof, that they are hereby fully empowered to admit that person applying to be a guardian for any Negro, Indian, mulatto, or mestizo, claiming his or her or their freedom, and such a guardian being able and entitled, capable in law, to bring an action of trespass in the nature of ravishment of ward, or against any person who shall claim property, or who shall be in the possession of any such Negro, Indian, mulatto, or mestizo, and the defendant shall and may plead the general issue in such an action brought, and the special matter may and shall be given in evidence, and upon general specific verdict found, judgment shall be given according to the very right of the cause, without having any regard to the defect of the proceedings, either in form or substance. And if judgment is given for the plaintiff, a special jury shall be made declaring that the ward of the plaintiff is free, and the jury shall access damages which the plaintiff's ward has sustained, and the court shall give judgment and award execution against the defendant for such damages, with the full cost of suit. But in cases a judgment shall be given for the defendant, the court is hereby fully empowered to inflict such collateral punishment, not extending to life or limb of the ward of the plaintiff, as they in their discretion shall think fit. So don't beat them to death, provided that any action suit be brought in pursuance of the direction of this act, but the burden of proof shall lay upon the plaintiff, as it shall always be presumed that every Negro, Indian, mulatto, and mestizo is a slave, unless contrary be made to appear. Indians in amity with this government accepted, in which case the burden of proof shall be on the defendant. In Georgia, the Act of the Assembly, May 1770. It is impossible for any humane or reflecting person to examine the provisions of the above law without the conviction of the injustice and cruelty. The Negro and etc. claim to be free, yet he can bring no suit to investigate his master's title or restrain him of his liberty unless one can be found merciful enough to become his guardian, subject in any event to the expense of troubling and conducting his cause, and the case of failure, the cost of the suit. In other words, if you're nigger of it costs. The judges and jurors will, in all probability, be slaveholders and interested, therefore, in some measure in the question of which they are to try. The whole community in which he lived may, so few are the exception, be said to be hostile to his success. Being a Negro, etc., by the word of the act, the burden of proof rests upon him, and he is presumed to be a slave till he make a contrary appear. This is to be effected through the instrumentality of white witnesses, as has been shown exclusively to the testimony of those who are not white, even though they may be free and of the fairest character. And lastly, notwithstanding all the obstacles to the ascertaining of the truth of the allegations, the terror superadded that should he not succeed, if you don't succeed, even if you get that, the judge and the jury has the right of freedom to the infliction of corporal punishment to any extent short of capital execution or the deprivation of a limb. How do you like that? Hmm. This is actually the law of this country, guys. It's still hardwired into it. We're still we're still dealing with this, and that's how we got this mess. I'm going to skip over to part 5 because this is the key thing. I love this. I love this. This is a really good one, and I'm going to stop after this. We'll stop at this and we'll go to another work. But this is from Strout's Sketch of the Laws in Slave States, 1827. Number 5, submission is required of the slave, right? The slave is the kiss behind, guys. In 1696, the question of whether the baptism of the Negro slave, in other words, becoming a Christian, without the privity or consent of his masters, emancipated the slave, underwent an elaborate discussion before the judges of the king's bench. Owing to a misconception of the form of the action, the final decision was not given, and the plaintiff being, of course, unsuccessful on that occasion, the doubts which have resulted from the former case were strengthened rather than impaired. Let me stop and say to you that because of the Crusades, it used to be seen by a custom that it was wrong for Christians to enslave each other. So there was a major incentive for people to become Christians, and of course, white folks shifted that around to make certain no, even if you like white Jesus, you still have to pick my cotton and get your ass beat by me. And it doesn't matter what a decent person you are. And to this day, that kind of behavior, if you're black, you're just bad. Hmm? And so let me skip over some. So I love that. You have to do what you're told by everyone. Okay? So submission is required of the slave, not to the will of his master only, but to the will of all other white persons. While the institution of slavery exists, everything like resistance to the master's lawful authority should be decisively checked. Strict subordination must be exacted from the slave, or bloodshed and murders will unavoidably ensue. The laws of slaveholding states demand, however, a much larger concession of power to the master than is here granted. They demand that the life of the slave shall be in the master's keeping, that the slave having the physical ability to avoid infliction of a barbarous or vindictive punishment by his master shall not be permitted to do so. You have no right to stand your ground, Carmelo Anthony. In 2025, Black Americans, when you defend yourself, you don't have the right. This goes back to it was a law and now it's a custom. Someone bothers you, you swing back and you get put in jail like a criminal because of the custom that you had no right to defend yourself. That the slave having the physical ability to avoid the infliction of a barbarous and vindictive punishment by his master shall not be permitted to do so. You must take the abuse. They go indeed beyond this. They place the slave under the like restriction in relation to every white person without discrimination as to character, with as little consideration as to the motives. That means if you're a Black woman, a slave back in the day, if a drunk, dirty man wants to rape you, you're to give it to him. This is what slavery was. So non-slave owning whites were doing stuff, and you had to take it. Okay? This is what we have. You can't say no. Thus, it enacted in Georgia, quote, if any slave shall presume to strike any white person, such a slave upon trial and conviction before the justice or justices, according to the directions of this act, shall for the first offense suffer such punishment as the said justice or justices shall, and his or their discretion think fit, not extending to life or limb, and for the second offense suffer death. If you even try to fight a second time, you must die. The law of South Carolina, as in the same words, except that the death is not made punishment in the second, but the third offense. In both of these states, a proviso is annexed to this law, which shows plainly that however wanton or dangerous may the attack be upon the slave, he is still compelled to submit, provided always that striking, etc., be done by the command and in defense of the person or property of the owner, or other persons having the care of the government of such a slave, in which case the slave shall be wholly excused, and the owner of the other person shall be answerable as if the act had been committed by himself. In Maryland, the Act of 1723, a justice of peace for the offense may direct the offender's ears to be cropped. In other words, your ears cut off. And this, though he be a free Black. In Kentucky, the same general principle is recognized, though enforced by penalties much less severe. Yet there in Maryland, free persons included, if any Negro, mulatto, or Indian, bond or free, shall at any time lift his or her hand in opposition to any person not being Negro, mulatto, or Indian, he or she so offending shall for every such offense proved by the oath of the party, this based on the word, whatever that white person said they did, before the justice of the peace of the county where such offense shall be committed, receive 30 lashes on his or her back, well laid by the order of such justice. Nearly similar to this law in Kentucky was that of Virginia. from the year 1680 to the year 1792, at which that latter date following the exception was added, except in those cases where it shall appear such justice that a negro or mulatto was wantonly assaulted and lifted his or her hand in her defense. There's a section of the law in Louisiana, which, though in terms applying to free people of color only, may be properly cited as evidence of the sentiments which are entertained there on this subject. The gravity with which the strange principle is asserts is declared, will itself excuse the introduction here, though not altogether congruous with the main object of the sketch. Quote, free people of color never color ought never to insult or strike white people, nor presume to conceive of themselves as equal to whites, but on the contrary, they ought to yield to them on every occasion and never speak or answer them, but with respect under the penalty of imprisonment according to the nature of that offense. Several slaveholding states have adopted laws which are highly objectionable for the reasons just given. Subjoined may they be taken as a specimen. If every slave shall happen to be slain for refusing to surrender him or herself contrary to the law, or unlawfully resisting any officer or other person who shall apprehend or endeavor to apprehend such slave or slaves, etc., such officer or other such persons, so killing such a slave as aforesaid, making resistance shall be, and he by this act indemnified from any prosecution for such killings. In other words, if someone wanted to kill 4 or 5 people because they felt like it, nothing could be done about it. If I'm a freaky, violent, sociopath, racist, I want to shoot a couple of black people and go nigger hunting with someone else's slave stock. If I say they attacked me, I feared for my life. Boom, boom, boom. They'd all pat him on the back and say, man, you did the best you could. That's the law. And by the Negro Act of 1740 of South Carolina, it's declared, quote, if any slave who shall be out of the house of the plantation where such a slave shall live, or shall usually be employed without some white person in the company of such slave, shall refuse to submit to undergo the examination of any white person. What they want to touch your penis or your vagina? Still, of any white person. It shall be lawful for any white person to pursue, apprehend, and moderately correct such a slave. And if such slave assault and strikes a white person, such a slave may be lawfully killed. Justifiable homicide. This is what happens with Tamir Rice and with Eric Garner and so many other people. You can be killed because I'm white. I felt like it. You wonder where this comes from, and it hasn't stopped. Now I'm at my favorite part, and this is almost over. And we can go to another work, but how do y'all like this? How y'all like this, Sister Star? Are y'all getting this? And I mean, the land of the free and home of the brave, and black people complain too much, and oh, nobody should have reparations, and every slaves were happy. Okay. I'm at part 6, and this is the last part I'm going to go through. The penal codes of slaveholding states bear much more severely upon slaves than upon white persons. Being ignorant of letters, unenlightened by religion, deriving but little instruction from good example, cannot be supposed to have the right conceptions as to the nature and extent of moral or political obligations. This remark, with but a slight qualification, is applicable to the condition of a slave. It has just been shown that the benefits of education are not conferred upon him while his chance of acquiring knowledge of the precept of the gospel is so remote as scarcely is to be appreciated. He may be regarded, therefore, as almost without the capacity to comprehend the force of laws, and, on this account, such are designed for the government should be recommended by the simplicity and mildness. His condition suggests another motive for the tenderness on his behalf in these particulars. He is unable to read, and holding little or no communication with those who are better informed than himself, how is he to become acquainted with the fact that a law for his observance has been made? To exact obedience to a law which has not been promulgated, which is unknown to the subject of it, has ever been deemed more unjust and tyrannical. The reign of Caligula, were it obnoxious to no other reproach than this, would never cease to be remembered with abhorrence. The lawgivers of the slaveholding states seem, and the formation of their penal codes, to have been uninfluenced by these claims of the slave upon their compassionate consideration. The hardest convict moves their sympathy, and it is to be taught that the laws before is expected to obey them. Yet the guiltless slave is subjected to an extensive system of cruel enactments, of no part which probably has he ever heard. Parts of this system apply to the slave exclusively, and for every infraction a large retribution is demanded. While with respect to offenses for which whites as well as slaves are amenable, the punishments are of much greater severity are inflicted upon the latter than upon the former. We see this to this day, where white folk get probation or they just write it off and they throw a black child in jail. With very few exceptions, the penal laws to which slaves only are subject, relate not only to the violations of the moral and divine laws, but positive institutions is only their sanction. Thus, if a slave is found beyond the limits of the town in which he lives, or off the plantation where he is usually employed, without the company of a white person, or without a written permission of his master, employer, etc., any person may apprehend and punish him with whipping on the bare back, not exceeding 20 lashes. In Mississippi, a similar punishment by direction of the justice of the peace. Also in Virginia and Kentucky, at the discretion of the justice, both of the imposition of the punishment and the number of stripes. I'm going to read this. This is in the footnote. It shall be the duty of the keeper of the penitentiary, on the receipt of the prisoner, to read to him or her such part of the penal law of the state as to impose penalties for escape, and to make all prisoners and the penitentiary acquainted with the same. It shall be his duty, on the discharge of the prisoner, to read to him or her such part of the said laws with the imposed additional punishments for the repetition of the offenses. So you'd have to go to jail to learn the law. If a slave be out of the house, etc., off the plantation, etc., of his master, etc., without some white person in company, etc., and shall refuse to submit to the examination of any white person, etc., such white person may apprehend and moderately correct him, and if he shall insult or strike such a white person, he may be lawfully killed. If any slave shall presume to come upon a plantation of any person without leave in writing from his master, employer, etc., not being sent on lawful business, the owner of the plantation may inflict 10 lashes for every such offense. That's Virginia's code. It shall be lawful for any person who shall see more than 7 men slaves without some white person with them, travailing or assembled together in any high road, to apprehend such slaves and inflict a whipping on each of them, not exceeding 20 lashes apiece. In Delaware, more than 6 men meeting together, not belonging to one master, unless on lawful business of their owners, may be whipped to the extent of 20 lashes each. If a slave or Indian shall take away or let loose any boat or canoe from landing on any other place where the owner may have made the same fast, For the first offense, he shall receive 39 lashes on his bare back. On the second offense, shall forfeit and have cut off of his head one ear. For keeping or carrying a gun, or powder, or shot, or club, or other weapon whatsoever offensive or defensive, a slave incurs for each instance 39 lashes by the order of the justice of the peace. And in North Carolina and Tennessee, 20 lashes by the nearest constable without a conviction of the justice. For having any article of property for sale without a ticket of permission from his master, particularly specifying the same, and authorizing it to be sold by the slave, 10 lashes by the order of the captain of the patty rollers. And if the slave be taken before the magistrate, 39 lashes may be ordered. A slave being at an unlawful assembly, the captain of the patty rollers may inflict lashes upon him. If taken before the magistrate, he may direct 39 lashes. For traveling by himself from his master's land to any other place, unless by the most usual and accustomed road, the owner of the land on which the slave may be found is authorized to inflict 40 lashes upon him. For traveling in the night without a pass, 40 lashes, or being found in another person's negro quarters or kitchen, 40 lashes, and every negro in those whose company such vagrant slaves shall be found incurs also 20 lashes. Any person may lawfully kill a slave who has been outlawed for running away and lurking in swamps, etc., etc. For hunting with dogs in the woods, even of his master, the slave is subject to a whipping of 30 lashes. A slave endeavoring another slave to run away, if provisions, etc., be prepared for the purpose of aiding such running away, shall be punished with death. And a slave who shall aid and abet a slave endeavoring to entice another slave to run away shall also suffer death. If a slave harboring, conceal, or entertain another slave being a runaway in South Carolina and Georgia, he is subjected to corporal punishment to any extent not affecting life or limb. In Maryland, 39 stripes is the penalty for harboring 1 hour. A slave being on horseback without the written permission of his master incurs 25 lashes. For keeping a dog, 25 lashes. For killing a deer, though by the command of his master, overseer, etc., unless such command can be proved by ticket in writing, 20 lashes. For being guilty of rambling, riding, or going abroad at night, or riding horses in the daytime without leave, a slave may be whipped, his ears cut off, or branded on the cheek with the letter R, and otherwise punished, not extended to life, or so as to render him unfit for labor. That's an act of Maryland. If a slave beat the Patuxent River, this is Baltimore. Okay. For the purposes of taking fish, he is to receive 10 lashes. If he places a seine across the Transquaquin or Chickawamico creeks, a justice of the peace may order him to receive 39 lashes. In other words, white people can fish, you can't, you're black. In conclusion, this branch of the present section may be added the recent act of the Assembly of the State of Mississippi of great cruelty relating to runaway slaves. It is entitled an act to amend an act, quote, an act to reduce into one the several acts concerning slaves, free Negroes, and mulattoes, and may be found among other laws in the session of 1824. The first section is in these words, quote, when any slave or slave shall be committed to any jail in the state as a runaway or runaways, it shall be the duty of the jail of the said county to interrogate him or him, her, or them as to his or her, their owner or their owner's name or places of residence. The account should be received together with the description of the slave or slaves. The jailer should forthwith transmit by mail to the owner or owners name the slave. And if by the statement made by the slave shall be proved false, it shall be the duty of the jailer without delay to give the said slave or each of them 25 lashes well laid on, and interrogate him or her anew, and transmit the intelligence obtained together with the description as foresaid to the owner or the owners again named, and the whip as before directed if a second false account is given, and so on, for the space of 6 months. It shall be the duty of a jailer alternatively to interrogate and whip the aforesaid whenever the said slave or slaves may give false accounts of his or her or their owners, names, or place of residence. To appreciate fully the cruelty of this law, it should be noted that the entire administration, inquisitorial and punitive, confined to a single person, a jailer, who from the nature of his office may have the slave wholly within his power, and yet for the abuse of the power and the ease within the meaning of the act, he may be regarded altogether irresponsible to anyone, without any design on the part of the slave either to pervert or conceal the truth. It is highly probable that his statement will, in many instances, be false, and in many more appear to be so. For the state of Mississippi as the greater part of the uncultivated and uninhabited, it is divided into but a few counties, and the number of post offices which have been established there are very small. The names of the proper post town must be frequently unknown even to white inhabitants, whose means of information are vastly superior to that slaves possess. The master's place of residence, which is mentioned in the act, may be very remote from the post office, and it should be known that the slave would afford as little assistance to the jailer as to the endorsement of his letter to the master. As overseers are usually employed in the plantations, it would not be thought strange that an ignorant slave should not be acquainted with his master's name, especially his Christian name. Proper names, both of men and places, are frequently spelled very differently from what the pronunciation would teach. The jailers are not ordinarily selected for good scholarship or extensive information. Added to the whole, it should be recollected that the miscarriages of letters, even when carefully and correctly endorsed, occur not seldom from the ignorance or inattention of the postmasters. Notwithstanding all of these considerations, the jailer may, in his discretion, determine when the slave's statement is false, and having inflicted the legal measure of flagellation, may repeat the same punishment again and again for the space of 6 months, or to use the language of the act, so characteristic of the callousness to the slave's suffering, with a familiarity with cruelty begets, and so on. For the space of 6 months, it shall be the duty of the jailer to alternately interrogate and to whip the foresaid. Okay, I come now to the exemplification of the second branch of this chapter, which may be stated in the following proposition: the penal code of the slaveholding states punishments much greater severity upon slaves than upon white persons convicted of similar offenses. In treating this proposition, I shall, in the first place, exhibit synopsis of the penal codes of the state of Virginia and Mississippi, so far as many may be necessary in order to comprise the offenses which are punished by death in those states. This section is recommended by the considerations that one of these states is old and the other a new state, that the codes of both have recently been revised, and in some measure by their relative geographic positions. Virginia will be first noticed. In this state, murder is in the first degree, arson at common law, willingly setting fire to a house in a town, or aiding or abetting, assisting, counseling, hiring, or commanding any person to do the same, are crimes severely punishable with death, whether the offender be white or black, bond, or free. Let me just show you the trick there. If you had to do whatever someone white said, if someone white ordered you to set a fire, you had to do it or you could be beaten. So they could get you to break the law and you would be executed. Just think about that. This table isn't that good, but I'm going to see what I can do with it. The following table will place the subject in a clear light, the reader bearing in mind the numeral signs prefixed to the crimes named in the first table are not designed to convey the idea that there's several exponents of the crime only. Okay, I'm going to skip this. Let me see if I can read this. Okay, some of the things that you could be executed for: murder, death; being away from where you're supposed to be, death; willfully setting fire, death; embezzling, death; horse stealing, death; harboring someone, death; counterfeiting, death; passing or trying to help someone do something around counterfeiting, death; counterfeiting a seal of an incorporated bank, death; forging or assisting or abetting, death; attempting to commit a rape on a white woman, death; burglary, death. Are y'all getting me? I'm going to stop here, but this is a little bit of this was written in 1927, I'm sorry, 1827, the same year that David Walker was writing this thing here. I'm going to read a little bit of him, and then we're going to come to the 20th century. How y'all doing? I had read this the other day, and so that was a white voice from then. Now I'm going to do a black voice, and then we're going to come into resistance. Let me see if I can read a little bit of this. I'm going to read Article 2 of David Walker. And I want to remind you as I read David Walker, and as I read to you, they're saying Indian and black in the same language, people. There are pretendians, and that's disgusting, but I'm very straight with people. I identify as black. I'm happy. My grandfather identified as black because he identified with his father's people, although my grandfather's father could pass for white. My grandfather's mother was very dark, but she's an Indian. He identified as black. Uh, this whole black Indian thing, this is a mess white people made. We need to claim our entire heritage. So I'm not kicking Africans out of the bed. I'm just pulling some Indians in it. And well, we're not trying to add any Europeans. Well, they'll force their way in, as they tend to do. Hmm. I'm in chapter 2 of David Walker's The Appeal. My beloved brethren, the Indians of North and South America, the Greeks, the Irish, subjected under the King of Britain, the Jews, that ancient people of the Lord, the inhabitants of the islands of the sea, and the fine and all inhabited in the earth, except, however, the sons of Africa are called men, and of course, of course are and ought to be free, but we colored people and our children are brutes, and of course ought to be slaves to the American people and their children forever, to dig their mines and work their farms, and thus go on enriching them from one generation to another with our blood and our tears. I promise in the preceding page to demonstrate the satisfaction of the most incredulous that we, colored people of these United States, are the most wretched, degraded, and abject set of beings that ever lived since the world began, and that the white Americans have reduced us to the wretched state of slavery, treat us in the condition more cruel, they being enlightened and Christian people, than any heathen nation did, any people whom it had reduced to our condition. These affirmations are so well uh, are so well are so well confirmed in the minds of all unprejudiced men who have taken the trouble to read the histories that they need no elucidation from me. But to put them beyond all doubt, I refer to the first place the children of Jacob or of Israel in Egypt under Pharaoh and his people. Some of my brethren did not know who Pharaoh and the Egyptians were. I know it to be a fact that some of them take the Egyptians to have been a gang of devils for not knowing any better, and that they, the Egyptians, having got possessions of the Lord's people, treated them nearly as cruel as Christian Americans do us at the present day. For the information of such, I would only mention that the Egyptians were African or colored people, such as we are, some of them yellow and others dark, a mixture of Ethiopians and the natives of Egypt, about the same as you see the colored people of the United States at the present day. I call your attention then to the children of Jacob, while I point out, particularly to you, his son Joseph, among the rest in Egypt. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than now. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee no man shall lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Now I appeal to heaven and earth, and particularly to the American people themselves, who cease not to declare that our condition is not hard, that we're comparatively satisfied to rest in the wretchedness and misery under them and their children, not indeed to show me a colored president, a governor, a legislator, a senator, a mayor, or an attorney at the bar, but you show me a man of color who holds a low office of a constable, or one who sits in the juror's box, or even on a case of one of his wretched brethren throughout this great republic. But let us pass Joseph, the son of Israel, a little farther for review, as he existed in the heathen nation. Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zapnath Paaneah, and he gave him to wife Asnath, the daughter of Potphera, the priest of On. And Joseph went on all over the land of Egypt. Compare above with the American institutions. Did they not institute laws to prohibit us from marrying among whites? I would wish, candidly, however, before the Lord, to be understood that I would never give a pinch of snuff to be married to any white person I ever saw in all the days of my life. And I do say it that the black man or man of color who will leave his own color, provided he can get one who is as good as anything, and marry a white woman, to be double a slave to her just because she is white, and ought to be treated by her as she surely will be vis-a-vis as a nigger. It is not indeed, Shannon Sharp, it is not indeed that what I care about intermarriages with whites, which induced me to pass this subject in review. For the Lord knows that there's a day coming where they will be glad enough to get in the company of blacks, notwithstanding we are in this generation leveled by them almost on the level with the brute creation. And some of us they treat even worse than they do the brutes that perish. I only made this extract to show how much lower we are held and how much more cruel we are treated by the Americans than were the children of Jacob by the Egyptians. We will notice the suffering of Israel some further under heathen Pharaoh as compared to ours under the enlightened Christians of America. As Pharaoh spoke unto Joseph, saying, Thy father and thy brethren are come unto thee. The land of Egypt is before thee, the best of the land. Make thy father and brethren to dwell in the land of Goshen. Let them dwell. If thou knowest any men of activity amongst them, then make them rulers over my cattle. I ask these people who treat us so well, I ask them, where's the most barren spot of land that they've given unto us? Israel has the most fertile land in all of Egypt. Need I mention the very notorious fact that I have known a poor man of color who labored night and day to acquire a little money, and having acquired it, he invested in a small piece of land and got him a house erected thereon, and having paid for the whole, he moved his family into it, where he suffered to remain but 9 months, when he was cheated out of his property by a white man and driven out the door. And this is not the case generally. Can a man of color buy a piece of land and keep it peaceably? Will not some white man try to get it from him, even if it is in a mud hole? I need not comment any further on the subject, which all, both black and white, will readily admit. But I must really observe that in the very city when a man of color dies, if he has owned any real estate, it most generally falls in the hands of some white person. The wife and children of the deceased may weep and lament if they please, but the estate will be kept snug enough by its white possessor. But prove farther that the condition of the Israelites was better under the Egyptians than ours under the whites. I call upon the professing Christians. I call upon the philanthropists. I call upon the very tyrant himself to show me a page of history, either sacred or profane, on which a verse can be found which maintains that the Egyptians heaped insupportable insult upon the children of Israel by telling them they were not of the human family. Can whites deny this charge? Have they not, having reduced us to a deplorable condition of slaves under their feet, held us up as descending originally from the tribes of monkeys or orangutans? Oh, my God, I appeal to every man of feeling. Is this not insupportable? Is it not heaping the most gross insult upon our miseries because they have not gotten us under their feet and we cannot help ourselves? Oh, pity us, we pray thee, Lord Jesus, Master. Has Mr. Jefferson declared to the world that we're inferior to whites, both in the endowments of our bodies and our minds? It is indeed surprising that a man of such great learning combined with such excellent natural parts should speak so of a set of men in chains. I do not know what to compare it to, unless like putting one wild deer in an iron cage where it will be secured to hold by another of the same side, then let it go and expect one in the cage to run as fast as the one at liberty. So far, my brethren, were the Egyptians from heaping these insults upon their slaves that Pharaoh's daughter took Moses, the son of Israel, for her own, as will be appearing in the following. Pharaoh's daughter said unto her Moses, her mother, take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will pay thee thy wages. The woman took the child Moses and nursed it, and the child grew, and she brought him into Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She called his name Moses, she said, because I drew him out of the water. In all probability, Moses would have become prince regent of the throne, and no doubt in the process of time would have been seated on the throne of Egypt. But he had rather suffer shame with the people of God than enjoy all the pleasures with the wicked people for a season. Oh, that the colored people were long since Moses' excellent disposition, instead of courting favor with, telling news and lies with our natural enemies against each other, aiding them, and keeping their hellish chains of slavery upon us. Would we not long before this time have been respectable men, instead of the wretched victims of oppression as we are? Would they be able to drag our mothers, our fathers, our wives, our children, and ourselves around the world in chains and handcuffs as they do, to dig up gold and silver for them and theirs? This question, my brother, I leave you to digest, and may God Almighty force it home into your hearts. Remember that unless you are united, keeping your tongues within your teeth, you will be afraid to trust your secrets to another, and thus perpetuate our miseries under Christians. Addition, remember, also to lay humble at the feet of our Lord and Master Jesus Christ with prayers and fasting. Let our enemies go on with their butcheries, and at once they fill their cup, never make an attempt to gain our freedom of natural right from under our cruel oppressors and murderers until you see your way clear. It is not to be understood here that I mean for us to wait until God shall take us by the hair of our heads and drag us out of the abject wretchedness and slavery, nor do I mean to convey the idea for us to wait upon our enemies shall make preparations to call us to seize those preparations and take it away from them, and put everything before us to death in order to gain our freedom which God has given us. For you must remember, we are men as well as they. God has been pleased to give us 2 eyes, 2 hands, 2 feet, and some sense in our heads as well as they. They have no more right to hold us in slavery than we have to hold them. We have just as much right, just in the sight of God, to hold them and their children in slavery and wretchedness as they hold to us, and no more. When that hour arrives and you move, be not afraid or dismayed, as you are assured that Jesus Christ, the King of heaven and earth, who is the God of justice and of armies, will surely go before you. And those enemies who have thousands of years, hundreds of years, stolen our rights and kept us ignorant of him and his divine worship, he will remove, millions of whom this day are so ignorant and avaricious, they cannot conceive of how God can have the attribute of justice and show mercy to us because it pleased him to make us black, which cover Mr. Jefferson calls unfortunate, as though we're not thankful to our God for having made us as it pleased himself, as they whites are they for having been made white. They think because they hold us and their infernal chains of slavery that we wish to be white or of their color. But they are dreadfully deceived. We wish to be as it pleased our Creator to have made us, with no avaricious and unmerciful wretches have any business to make slaves of or to hold us in slavery. How would they like for us to make slaves of and hold them in cruel slavery and murder them as they do us? But is Mr. Jefferson's assertions true? That it's unfortunate for us that our Creator has been so pleased as to make us black. It will not take his say so. In fact, the world will have an opportunity to see whether it is unfortunate for us that our Creator has made us darker than whites. Fear not the number and education of our enemies against whom we shall have to contend for our lawful right guaranteed us by our Maker. For why should we be afraid when God is and will continue if we continue humble to be on our side? The man who would not fight under our Lord and Master Jesus Christ in the glorious heavenly cause of freedom and of God, to be delivered from the most wretched, abject, and servile slavery that has ever afflicted with since the foundation of the world to the present day, ought to be kept with all of his children or family in slavery or in chains to be butchered by his cruel enemies. I saw a paragraph a few years since in South Carolina paper, which, speaking of the barbarity of the Turks, it said, the Turks are the most barbarous people in the world. They treat the Greeks more like brutes than human beings. And in the same paper was advertised, which said, 8 well-built Virginia and Maryland Negro fellows and 4 winches will possibly be sold this day to the highest bidder. And what astonished me still more was to see the same humane paper, the cuts of the 3 men with clubs and with budgets on their backs, and with an advertising offering a considerable sum of money for their apprehension and delivery. I declare it is really so amusing to hear Southerners and Westerners of this country talk about the barbarity that is positively enough to make a man smile. The suffering of the Helots among the Spartans were somewhat severe, if it is true, But to say that their errors were as severe as ours among the Americans, I must strenuously deny. For instance, can a man show me an article on a page of ancient history which specifies that the Spartans chained and handcuffed helots and dragged them from their wives and children from their parents, and mothers from their suckling babes, and wives from their husbands, driving them from one end of the country to the other? Know the Spartans were heathens who lived long before our divine master made his appearance in the flesh. Can Christian Americans deny these barbarous cruelties? Have you not Americans been subjected as us under you to the added miseries of insulting us, telling us to our faces, because we are helpless, that we are not of the human family? I ask you, O Americans, I ask you in the name of the Lord, can you deny these charges? Some perhaps may deny by saying that they never thought or said that we were not men. But do not their actions speak louder than words? Have they not made a provision for the Greeks and the Irish, nations who have never done the least thing for them, while we, who have enriched their country with our blood and tears, have dug up gold and silver for them and their children from generation to generation, and are more miseries than any other people under heaven, are not seen but a comparatively a handful of American people? There are indeed more ways to kill a dog besides choking it to death with butter. Further, the Spartans and Lacedaemonians had some frivolous pretext for enslaving Helots, for they, the Helots, while being free inhabitants of Sparta, stirred up an intestine commotion, and were by the Spartans subdued, made prisoners of war. Consequently, they and their children were condemned to perpetual slavery. I have been for years troubling the pages of historians to find out what our fathers had done to white Christians of America to merit such a condign punishment as they have inflicted upon them and do continue to inflict on us, their children. But I must aver that my researches have hitherto been of no effect. I have therefore come to the unmovable conclusion that they Americans have and do continue to punish us for nothing else but for the enriching of them for their country. For I cannot conceive of anything else, nor do I ever believe otherwise until the Lord shall convince me. The world knows that slavery as it exists among the Romans, which the primary cause of their destruction, was comparatively speaking no more than a cipher when compared with ours under the Americans. Indeed, I should not have noticed the Roman slaves had not the very learned and penetrating Jefferson said, when a master was murdered, all of his slaves in the same house or within hearing were condemned to death. Let me ask Mr. Jefferson, but he has gone to answer the bar of God for the deeds done in his body while living. I therefore ask the whole American people, had I not rather die or be put to death than to be a slave to any tyrant who takes not only my own, but my wife and my children's lives by the inches? Yea, would I meet death with the avidity of far in preference to the servile submission to the murderous hands of tyrants. Mr. Jefferson's very severe remarks on us have been so extensively argued upon by men whose attainment in literature I shall never be able to reach that I would not have meddled with it, were it not to solicit each of my brother who has the spirit of a man to buy a copy of Mr. Jefferson's Notes on Virginia and to put it in the hand of his son. For let no one of us suppose that the refutations which have been written by our white friends are enough. They are whites, we are blacks. We and the world wish to see the charges of Mr. Jefferson refuted by blacks themselves according to their chance. For we must remember, and what the whites have written respecting the subject is other men's labors, and did not emanate from blacks. I know well that there are some talents of learning among colored people in this country which we have not a chance to develop in consequence of oppression. But our oppression ought not hinder us from acquiring all that we can, for we have a chance to develop them by and by. God will not suffer us to always be oppressed. Our suffering will come to an end. In spite of all of America's side of this eternity, we will want all the learning and talents among ourselves and perhaps more to govern ourselves. Every dog must have its day. The Americans is coming to an end. Let us review Mr. Jefferson's remark respecting us some further. Comparing our miserable fathers with the learned philosophers of Greek, he says, yet notwithstanding these and other discouraging circumstances among the Romans, their slaves were often their rarest artists. They excelled too in science inasmuch in so much as to be usually employed as tutors to their masters' children. Epictetus, Terence, Phaedrus were slaves, but they were of the race of whites. It is not their condition, but their nature which has produced the distinction. See this, my brethren? Do you believe this assertion is swallowed by millions of whites? Do you know that Mr. Jefferson was one of the greatest characters that ever lived among whites? See his writings for the world, his public labors for the United States of America. Do you believe that the assertions of such a man will pass away into oblivion unobserved by the people and the world? If you do, you are much mistaken. See how American people treat us. Have we souls in our bodies? Are we men who have spirits at all? I know that there are many swell-bodied, swell-bellied fellows among us whose greatest object is to fill their stomachs. Such I do not mean. I'm after those who know and feel that we are men, as well as other people, right? To them, I say that unless we try to refute Mr. Jefferson's arguments respecting us, we will only establish them. But the slaves among the Romans, everybody who has read history knows that as soon as the slave among the Romans obtained his freedom, he would rise to the greatest eminence in the state. And there was no law instituted to hinder a slave from buying his freedom. Have not the Americans instituted laws to hinder us from obtaining our freedom? Do any deny this charge? Read the laws of Virginia, North Carolina, etc. Further, have not the Americans instituted laws to prohibit man of color from obtaining and holding any office whatever under the government of the United States of America? Now, Mr. Jefferson tells us our condition is not so hard as slaves were under the Romans. It is time for me to bring this article to a close, but before I close it, I must observe, my brethren, that at this close of the first revolution in this country with Great Britain, there were but 13 states of the Union. Now there are 24, most of which are slaveholding states, and the whites are dragging us around in chains and in handcuffs to their new states and territories to work their mines and farms to enrich them and their children. And millions of them are believing firmly that we, being a little darker than they, were made by our Creator to be an inheritance to them and their children for forever, the same as parcels of brutes. We are men. I ask you, O my brethren, are we men? Did our Creator make us to be slaves to dust and ashes like ourselves? Are they not dying worms as well as we? Have they not to make their appearance before the tribunal of heaven to answer for the deeds done in the body as well as we? Have we any other master but Jesus Christ alone? Is he not their master as well as ours? What right then have we to obey and call any other master but himself? How could we be so submissive to a gang of men whom we cannot tell whether they are good as ourselves or not? I could never conceive. However, this is shut up with the Lord, and we cannot precisely tell. But I do declare, we judge men by their works. White have always been unjust, jealous, unmerciful, avaricious, and bloodthirsty set of beings, always seeking after power and authority. We view them all over the Confederacy of Greece, where they're the first known to be anything in consequence of education. We see them there cutting each other's throats, trying to subject each other to the wretchedness and misery to effect which they use all kinds of deceitful, unfair, and unmerciful means. We view them next in Rome, where the spirit of tyranny and deceit raged still higher. We view them in Gaul, Spain, and Britain, and find we view them all over Europe together with what were scattered about Africa and Asia as heathens, and we see them acting more like devils than accountable men. But some may ask, did not the blacks of Africa and the mulattoes of Asia go on the same way as the whites of Europe? I answer no. They were never half as avaricious, deceitful, or unmerciful as the whites according to their knowledge. But we will leave the whites and the Europeans as heathens and take a view of them as Christians, in which capacity we see them as cruel, if not more than ever. In fact, take them as a body, they are 10 times more cruel, avaricious, and unmerciful than ever they were. For while they were heathens, they were bad enough, it is true. But it's a positive fact that they were not quite as audacious to go and take vessels, loads of men, women, and children, and in cold blood and through devilishness throw them into the sea, murder them all kinds of ways. While they were heathens, they were too ignorant for such barbarity. But being Christians and enlightened and sensible, they are completely prepared for such hellish cruelties. Now, suppose God were to give them more sense. What would they do? If it were possible, would they not dethrone Jehovah and seat themselves upon his throne? I, therefore, in the name and fear of the Lord God of heaven and of earth, divest of prejudice on either side of my color or that of whites, advance my suspicion of them, whether they are as good by nature as we or not. Their actions since they have known us as a people have been the reverse. I do suspect them, but this, as I before observed, is shut up with the Lord. We cannot exactly tell. It will be proved in succeeding generations that the whites had the essence of the gospel as it was preached by the Master and his apostles. The Ethiopians have not, who to have it in its meridian splendor, the Lord gave it to them to their satisfaction. I hope and pray, my God, that they will make good use of it and that it may be well with them. It is my solemn belief that if ever the world becomes Christianized, which must certainly take place before long, it will be through the means under God and the blacks who are now held in wretchedness and degradation by the white Christians of the world, who before they learn to do justice to us before our Maker and be reconciled to us and reconcile us to them, that the means to have a clear conscience before God and man, send out missionaries to convert heathens, many of whom, after they cease to worship gods, which neither they can see or hear, become 10 times more the children of hell than ever they ever were. Why was that reason? The reason is obvious. They must learn to do justice at home before they can go into distant lands to display their charity. Christianity and benevolence, when they learn to do the justice, God will accept their offering. No man may think that I'm against missionaries, for I am not. My object is to see justice done at home before we go to convert heathens. That was Article 1 of David Walker's appeal. What y'all say? I'm not done. I just wanted you to hear from a black man. You heard from a white guy talk about the condition. Now, let's do some contemporary stuff. I have like 3 works, and I'm going to be reading from. I'll read a little bit from each of them. In case you guys didn't hear, one of the churches that Dr. King was organizing the trash workers strike in Memphis burned to the ground within the last 2-3 days, and I absolutely want y'all to know I can't prove it, but I don't think it was an accident. And I want to say to you, take a second here, get my snaz together on. Hold on. Wow. That with all the things going on in the country and the Diddy trial upcoming, we're at a very weird place. I feel a lot of tension. I don't want anything to happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if we don't have a repeat of the kind of behavior that we had in the 1960s as early as next month, June. There are a lot of things in the country that are just terrible, and people need to. I'm reading some of these things because you'll see a continuum. Um, I just was on a space the other night. Tariq Nasheed had a space, and I just checked in. And I just got my copy of this. You may want to get one. The Kerner Commission study. Kerner Commission study. It's talks about the riots and and you really should have this in your library. Um, and I'm going to be reading some of it to just talk about what we're dealing with. And let me see. Let me see what I can do on that. And the Kerner Commission study was was a response. The government wanted to figure out what happened. That we had riots all over the country, Detroit, Newark, and some of the stuff. When I start reading this Kerner Commission study, I'm going to read some of the introductory summary. Going to skip around some of it. And I had two other companion books I got, and I thank everybody for, like, people like Sister Star. Um, People won't believe, I'd be like pooling my donations and like grabbing this. This is a very good one. Um, this was never before published. This is called The Harvest of American Racism. Um, and it's got some of the report that was never released. So I might go to this right after I do some of the summary. It's by Robert Sewell as the editor, and this is just talking about some of the stuff that happened. So I'm going to go through some of the communities, and you'll find this interesting. And then, because 1967, we're coming up on 60 years of Watts in, trying to think, when was Watts? Watts was like August. Let me, forgive me for forgetting when Watts occurred, but I know it was after. It's at some point. Yeah, it would have probably been in August. Um, this is a book called Two Societies, The Writing of 1967 and the Writing of the Kerner Report. A lot of the stuff that you see people screaming about, DEI and all of that, a lot of the stuff was a response to riots all over the country, rebellions that happened. Actually, uh, the rebellion started, the first one, they tend to focus on Watts, but one of the first mass civil unrest things happened in D.C. in 1961. were black youth at, I guess, the All-Star game at the Robert, I'm sorry, at the stadium, the DC stadium, and basically started beating white folks' asses. I'm not saying it's right. Just saying whatever, somebody did something and people started fighting back and beating people up, and you don't really hear about that. That was DC 1961. The next one that they don't really talk about happened in Birmingham. There was a riot in '63, right after they blew up those girls and the 16th Street Baptist Church and shot down two boys. So there are riots in Birmingham. You normally don't hear about that. They talk about the girls, but there's a riot in Birmingham in '63. In '64, there were disturbances in Jersey, disturbances in Rochester, disturbances in Harlem, where basically black folks were fed up. And now they've dispersed people throughout the country, but a lot of things people really angry at. You said August. Yeah, that's right. August 1965. Thank you, Sister Miriam. I knew it was August. Forgive me. A lot's going on. But I want to go through some of this. Let me see, it's 12. I may give another hour to this. And let's see what we can learn. Okay, but I'm going to start reading from the summary of the Kerner report. Then I'm going to look at the other two books. But you can get this on Amazon. These used to be a small paperback book you could get for 50 cents or $1. But if you go on eBay, these books sometimes are $100. It's astounding. It's astounding how much these books cost. And so, anyway, my thought is, if I can be your humble servant, is share some of what I get my hands on. And so let me just go into the Kerner Commission study. Are you guys good? Is everybody good? Let me see. I'm going to read some of this summary. And when you hear it, it's going to sound more or less like what you've already heard. Introduction reads, and let me have some reading enhancing drug. I love reading enhancing drugs. I have some ashwagandha here too. I should have some. I just need to be a little high, okay? But a natural one. Okay. Introduction. The summer of 1967 again brought racial disorder to American cities, with them shock, fear, and bewilderment to the nation. The worst came during a 2-week period during July, first in Newark and then in Detroit. Each set off a chain reaction in the neighboring communities. On July 28, 1967, the President of the United States, that's Lyndon Baines Johnson, established a commission and directed us to answer these 3 questions. What happened? Why did it happen? What can be done to prevent it from happening again? To respond to these questions, we have undertaken a broad range of studies and investigations. We have visited the riot cities. We have heard many witnesses. We have sought the counsel of experts across the country. This is our conclusion. Our nation is moving towards 2 societies, one black and one white, separate and unequal. Reaction to last summer's disorders has quickened the movement and deepened the division. Discrimination and segregation have long permeated American life. They now threaten the future of every American. This deepening racial division is not inevitable. The movement apart can be reversed. The choice is still possible. Our principal task is to define that choice and to press for a national resolution. To pursue our present course will involve the continuing polarization of the American community and ultimately the destruction of basic democratic values. The alternative is not blind repression or capitulation of lawlessness. It is the realization of the common opportunities for all within a single society. This alternative will require a commitment to national action, compassionate, massive, and sustained, backed by the resources of the most powerful and richest nation on this earth. From every American, it will require new attitudes, new understanding, above all, new will. The vital needs of the nation must be met. Hard choices must be made, and, if necessary, new taxes enacted. Violence cannot build a better society. Disruption and disorder nourish repression, not justice. They strike at freedom of every citizen. The community cannot and will not tolerate coercion and mob rule. Violence and destruction must be ended. And the streets of the ghetto and the lives of the people. Segregation and poverty have created the racial ghetto, a destructive environment totally unknown to most white Americans. What white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintained it, and white society condones it. It is time now to turn with all purpose at our command to the major unfinished business of this nation. It is time to adopt strategies for action that will produce quick and visible progress. It is time to make good the promises of American democracy to all of its citizens, urban and rural, white and black, Spanish surname, American Indian, and every minority group. Our recommendations embrace three basic principles: to mount programs on an equal scale to the dimension of the problems, to aim these programs for high impact in the immediate future in order to close the gap between promise and performance, to undertake new initiatives and experiments that can change the system of failure and frustration that now dominates the ghetto and weakens our society. These programs will require unprecedented levels of funding and performance, but they will neither probe deeper nor demand more than the problem which called them forth. There can be no higher priority for national action and no higher claim on the nation's conscience. We issue this report now, 5 months before the date called for by the president. Much remains that can be learned. Continual study is essential. As commissioners, we have worked together with a sense of the greatest urgency and have sought to compose whatever differences exist amongst us. Some differences remain, but the gravity of the problem and the pressing need for action are too clear to allow further delay in the issuance of this report. What happened? Profiles of disorder. The report contains profiles of a selection of disorders that took place during the summer of 1967. These profiles are designed to indicate how the disorders happened, who participated in them, and how local officials, police forces, and the National Guard responded. Illustrative excerpts follow. It was decided to attempt to channel the energies of the people into a nonviolent protest. While Lofton promised the crowd that a full investigation would be made of the Smith incident, the other Negro leaders began urging those in the scene to form a line and march towards City Hall. Some persons joined the line of the march, others milled about the narrow street. From the dark grounds of the housing projects came a barrage of rocks. Some of them fell among the crowd. Others hit persons in the line of the march. Many smashed windows of the police station. The rock throwing, it is believed, was the work of youngsters. Approximately 2,500 children lived in the housing project. Almost at the same time, an old car was set afire in the parking lot. The line of the march began to disintegrate. The police, their heads protected by World War I type helmets, sallied forth to disperse the crowd. A fire engine arrived on the scene, was pelted with rocks. As the police drove the people away from the station, they scattered in all directions. A few minutes later, a nearby liquor store was broken into. Some persons seeing a caravan of cabs appear at City Hall to protest Smith's arrest, interpreted as evidence that the disturbance had been organized and generated rumors to that effect. However, only a few stores were looted. Within a short period of time, disorder appeared to have run its course. On Saturday, July 15th, Director of Police Dominic Spina received a report of snipers in a housing project. When he arrived, he saw approximately 100 National Guardsmen and police officers crouching behind vehicles, hiding in corners, lying on the ground around the edge of the courtyard. Since everything appeared to be quiet and it was broad daylight, Spina walked directly down the middle of the street. Nothing happened. As he came to the last building of the complex, he heard a shot. All around him, the troopers jumped, believing themselves to be under sniper fire. A moment later, a young guardsman ran from behind a building. The director of the police went over and asked him had he fired the shot. The soldier said yes. He had fired to scare a man away from the window, that his orders were to keep people away from the windows. Spina said to the soldier, "Do you know what you just did? You have created a state of hysteria. Every guardsman up and down the street, and every policeman, and every city policeman that is present thinks that somebody just fired a shot, and it's probably a sniper." A short time later, more gunshots were heard. Investigating, Spina came upon a Puerto Rican sitting on a wall, and in reply to a question to whether he knew whether the firing was coming from, the man said, "There's no firing, it's fireworks. If you look up on the fourth floor, you'll see people who are throwing down cherry bombs." By this time, 4 truckloads of National Guardsmen had arrived. Troopers and policemen were again crouched everywhere looking for a sniper. The director of the police remained at the scene for 3 hours, and the only hot shots fired was the one by the guardsman. Nevertheless, at 6 o'clock that evening, 2 columns of National Guardsmen and state troopers were directing mass fire at the Hayes housing project in response to what they believed were snipers. A spirit of carefree nihilism was taking hold. To riot and destroy appeared to be more and more to become the ends in themselves. Late Sunday afternoon, it appeared to one observer that the young people were dancing amid the flames. A Negro plainclothes officer was standing at the intersection when a man threw a Molotov cocktail into a business establishment at the corner. In the heat of the afternoon, fanned by 20 to 25 miles per hour winds of both Sunday and Monday, the fire reached the next door within minutes. As residents uselessly sprayed the flames with garden hoses, the fire jumped from roof to roof of adjacent 2-3-story buildings. Within an hour, the entire block was in flames. The ninth house in the burning row belonged to the arsonist who had thrown the Molotov cocktail. Employed as a private guard, 55-year-old Julius L. Dorsey, a Negro, was standing in front of a market when accosted by 2 Negro men and a woman. They demanded he permit them to loot the market. He ignored their demands. They began to berate him. He asked a neighbor to call the police. As an argument grew more heated, Dorsey fired 3 shots from his pistol in the air. The police radio reported, "Looters, they have rifles." A patrol car driven by the police officers carrying 3 National Guardsmen arrived. As the looters fled, the law enforcement personnel opened fire. When the firing ceased, one person lay dead. He was Julius L. Dorsey. As the riot ultimately waxed and waned, one area of the ghetto remained insulated. It was the northeast side residence of some 150 square blocks, inhabited by 21,000 persons, had in 1966 banded together with the Positive Neighborhood Action Committee, PNAC. With professional help of the Institute of Urban Dynamics, they had organized block clubs, and it made plans for the improvement of the neighborhood. When the riot broke out, the residents, through block clubs, were able to organize quickly. Youngsters, agreeing to stay in the neighborhood, participated in deterring traffic. Many persons reported sympathized with the idea of rebelling against the system. Only two fires were set, one in an empty building. According to Lieutenant Governor Throckmorton and Colonel Bowling, the city at this time was saturated with fear. The National Guardsmen were afraid, the citizens were afraid, the police were afraid. Numerous persons, the majority of them Negroes, were being injured by gunshot of undetermined origin. The general and his staff felt the major task of the troops was to reduce the fear and restore an air of normalcy. In order to accomplish this, every effort was made to establish contact and rapport between the troops and the residents. The soldiers, 20% of whom were Negro, began helping to clean up the streets, collect garbage, and trace persons who had disappeared in the confusion. Residents in the neighborhoods responded with soup and sandwiches for the troops. In the areas where the National Guard tried to establish rapport with the citizens, there was a similar response. Now, that was Detroit. I'm in New Brunswick. A short time later, elements of a crowd, older and rougher than the night before, appeared in front of the police station. The participants wanted to see the mayor. Mayor Patricia Sheehan went out on the steps of the station. Using a bullhorn, she talked to the people and asked them to be given an opportunity to correct the conditions. The crowd was boisterous. Some persons challenged the mayor's, founded the opinion she's new, give her a chance, prevailed. A demand was issued by the people in the crowd that persons arrested the previous night be arrested. Told that this had already been done, the people were suspicious. They asked to be allowed to inspect the jail cells. It was agreed to permit representatives of the people to look into the cells to satisfy themselves that everyone had been released. The crowd dispersed. The New Brunswick riot failed to materialize. Chapter 2, Patterns of Disorder. The typical riot did not take place. The disorders of 1967 were unusual, irregular, complex, unpredictable social processes. Like most human events, they did not unfold in an orderly sequence. However, an analysis of our survey information leads some conclusions about the riot process in general. The civil disorders of 1967 involved Negroes acting against loyal symbols of white American society authority and property in Negro neighborhoods rather than against white persons. Of the 164 disorders reported during the first 9 months of 1967, 5% were major in terms of violence and damage. 33, 20% were serious, but not major. 123, 75% were minor, and undoubtedly would not have received national attention as riots had. The nation had not been sensitized by more serious outbreaks. In the 75 disorders studied by the Senate subcommittee, 83 deaths were reported. 82% of the deaths, more than half of the injuries, occurred in Detroit and Newark. About 10% of the dead and 36% of the injured were public employees, primarily law enforcement officers and firemen. The overwhelming majority of the persons killed or injured in all the disorders were Negro civilians. The initial damage estimates were greatly exaggerated. In Detroit, newspaper damage estimates ranged from $200 to $500 million. The highest recent estimate was $45 million. In Newark, early estimates ranged from $15 to $25 million. A month later, the damage was estimated at $10.2 million. 80% in inventory losses. In 24 disorders in 23 cities we surveyed. A final incident before the outbreak of the disorder. The initial violence itself generally took place in the evening or the night at the place of which it was normal for many people to be on the streets. Violence usually occurred almost immediately after the occurrence of the final precipitating incident, then escalated rapidly. With few exceptions, violence subsided during the day and flared rapidly again at night. Night-day cycles continued through an early period of the major disorders. Disorder generally began with rock and bottle throwing and window breaking. Once store windows were broken, looting usually followed. Disorder did not erupt as a result of a single triggering or precipitating incident. Instead, it was generated out of an increasingly disturbed social atmosphere in which typically series of tension heightening incidents over a period of weeks or months became linked in the minds of many in the Negro community with a reservoir of underlying grievances. At some point, the mounting tension, a further incident in and of it in itself often routine or trivial, became the breaking point, and the tension spilled into violence. Prior incidents, which increased tensions, ultimately led to the violence where police actions, in almost half the cases, police actions were the final incidents before the outbreak of violence in 12 of the 24 surveyed disorders. No particular control tactic was successful in every situation. The varied effectiveness of control techniques emphasized the need for advanced training, planning, adequate intelligence systems, and knowledge of the ghetto community. Negotiation between the Negroes, including young militants as well as older Negro leaders, and white officials concerning terms of peace occurred during virtually all the disorders surveyed. In many cases, these negotiations involved discussions of underlying grievances as well as the handling of the disorder by the control authorities. The typical rioter was a teenager or young adult, a lifelong resident in the city in which he rioted, a high school dropout. He was nevertheless somewhat better educated than his non rioting Negro neighbor and was usually underemployed or employed in a menial job. He was proud of his race, extremely hostile to both white and middle class Negroes, and although informed about politics, highly distrustful of the political system. A Detroit survey revealed approximately 11% of the total residents of the two riot areas admitted participation in the rioting. 20 to 25% identified themselves as bystanders. Over 16% identified themselves as counter rioters who urged rioters to cool it. And the remaining 48 to 53% said that they were at home or elsewhere and did not participate. In a survey of Negro males between the ages of 15 and 35 residing in the disturbance area in Newark, about 45% identified themselves as rioters and about 55% as non involved. Most rioters were Negro males. Nearly 50% of the arrestees were between 15 and 24 years of age, nearly 84% between the ages of 15 and 35. And Detroit and Newark, about 74% of the rioters were brought up in the North. In contrast to the non-involved, 36% of the Detroit and 52% in Newark were brought up in the North. What the rioters appeared to be seeking was full participation in the social order and material benefits enjoyed by the majority of American citizens. Rather than rejecting the American system, they were anxious to obtain a place for themselves in it. Numerous Negro counter-rioters walked the streets urging rioters to cool it. The typical counter-rioter was better educated, had a higher income than either the rioter or the non-involved. The proportion of Negroes in local government was substantially smaller than the Negro proportion of the population. Of the three, 20 cities studied had more than one Negro legislator. None had ever had a Negro mayor or city manager, and only 4 cities did the Negroes hold other important policy-making positions to serve as head of municipal departments. Although most of the cities had some sort of formal grievance mechanism for handling citizen complaints, this was typically regarded by the Negroes as an ineffective and generally ignored. Although specific grievances varied from city to city, at least 12 deeply held grievances can be identified and ranked into 3 levels of relative intensity. First level of intensity: Surprise, surprise, people. Police practices, unemployment or underemployment, inadequate housing, second level of intensity, inadequate education, poor recreation facilities and programs, ineffectiveness of the political structure and grievance mechanisms, third level of intensity, disrespectful white attitudes, discriminatory administration of justice, inadequacy of federal programs, inadequacy of municipal services, discriminatory consumer and credit policies, inadequate welfare programs. The result of the three-study survey by various federal programs, manpower, education, housing, welfare, and community action indicate that despite substantial expenditures in the number of persons assisted, only constituted a fraction of those in need. The background of the disorder is often as complex and difficult to analyze as the disorder itself. But we find certain general conclusions can be drawn. Social and economic conditions in the riot cities constitute a clear pattern of severe disadvantage for Negroes compared with whites, whether the Negroes lived in the area where the riot took place or outside of it. Negroes had completed fewer years of education, fewer had attended high school. Negroes were twice as likely to be unemployed and three times as likely to be as unskilled and in service jobs. Negroes averaged 70% of the income earned by whites and were more than twice as likely to be living in poverty. Although housing cost Negroes relatively more, they had worse housing, three times as likely to be overcrowded and substandard. When compared to white suburbs, the relative disadvantage was even more pronounced. A study of the aftermath disorder leads to disturbing conclusions. We find that despite the institutions of some of the post-riot programs, little basic change in the conditions underlying the outbreak of disorder had taken place. Actions to ameliorate Negro grievances have been limited and sporadic. With but few exceptions, they have not significantly reduced tensions. And several cities, the principal official response has been to train and equip the police with more sophisticated weapons. And several cities, increasing polarization is evidenced with continuing breakdown of interracial communication, the growth of white segregationists or black separatist groups. Chapter 3. Organized activity. The president directed the commission to investigate to what extent, if any, there had been planning or organization in any of the riots. To carry out this part of the president's charge, the commission established a special investigative staff, supplementing the field teams that made the general examination of the riots in 23 cities. The unit examined data collected by the federal agencies and congressional committees, including thousands of documents supplied by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, gathered and evaluated information from the local and state law enforcement agencies and officials, and conducted its own field investigations in selected cities. On the basis of all the information collected, the commission concludes that the urban disorders of the summer of 1967 were not caused by, nor were they the consequences of a plan or conspiracy. Specifically, the commission has found no evidence that all or any of the disorders or the incidents that led to them were planned or directed by any organization or group, international, national, or local. Militant organizations, local and national, and individual agitators repeated the forecasts and called for violence, were active in the spring and summer of 1967. We believe that they sought to encourage violence, and they helped to create an atmosphere that contributed to the outbreak of the disorder. We recognize that the continuation of disorders and the polarization of the races would provide further ground for the organized exploitation in the future. Investigations of the organized activity are continuing at all levels of government, including the committees of Congress. These investigations relate not only to the disorders of 1967, but also the actions of groups and individuals, particularly in schools and colleges, during last fall and winter. The commission has cooperated with these investigations, and they should continue. How y'all feeling? And addressing the question, why did it happen? We shift our focus from local to the national scene, from the particular events of the summer of 1967 to factors within the society at large that created a mood of violence among many urban Negroes. These factors are complex and interacting. They're very significant. They vary significantly in their effect from city to city and from year to year. The consequences of one disorder generating new grievances and new demands became causes of the next. Thus was created a thicket of tension, conflicting evidence, extreme opinions cited by the president. Despite these complexities, certain fundamental matters are clear. Of these, the most fundamental is racial attitude and behavior of white Americans toward black Americans. Race prejudice has shaped our history decisively. It now threatens to affect our future. White racism is essentially responsible for the explosive mixture which has been accumulating in our cities since the end of World War II. Among these ingredients are pervasive discrimination and segregation in employment, education, and housing, which have resulted in continuing exclusion of great numbers of Negroes from the benefits of the economic progress. Black in-migration and white exodus, which has produced massive growing concentrations of impoverished Negroes in our major cities, creating a growing crisis of deteriorating facilities and services and unmet human need. Black ghettos, where segregation and poverty converge on the young to destroy opportunity and enforce failure. Crime, drug addiction, dependency on welfare, and bitterness and resentment against in general white society in particular are the result. At the same time, most whites and Negroes outside the ghetto have prospered to a degree unparalleled in the history of civilization. Through television and other media, this affluence has been flaunted before the eyes of the Negro poor and jobless ghetto youth. Yet these facts alone cannot be said to be the cause of the disorders. Recently, other powerful ingredients have begun to catalyze this mixture. Frustrated hopes are the residue of the unfulfilled expectations by the great judicial and legislative victories of the civil rights movement and the dramatic struggle for equal rights in the South. A climate that tends towards approval and encouragement of violence as a form of protest has been created by white terrorism directed against nonviolent protests, by the open defiance of law of the federal authority, by the state and local officials resisting desegregation, and by some protest groups engaging in civil disobedience who turn their backs on nonviolence and go beyond the constitutionally protected rights of petition and free assembly and resort to violence to attempt to compel alteration of laws and policies with which they disagree. Frustrations of powerlessness have led some Negroes to the conviction that there's no effective alternative to violence as a mean of achieving a redress of grievances and moving the system. These frustrations are reflected in the alienation and hostility towards the institutions of law and government and the white society which controls them, and in the reach of black consciousness and solidarity reflected in the slogan Black Power. A new mood has sprung up among Negroes, particularly among the young, and with self-esteem, enhanced racial pride are replacing apathy and submission to the system. The police are not merely a spark factor. To some Negroes, the police have come to symbolize white power, white racism, and white repression. And the fact is that many police do reflect and express these white attitudes. The atmosphere of hostility and cynicism is reinforced by widespread belief among Negroes in the existence of police brutality and in a double standard of justice and protection, one for Negroes and one for whites. To this point, we have attempted to only identify the prime components of the explosive mixture. And the chapters that follow, we seek to analyze them in a perspective of history. Their meanings, however, is clear. The summer of 1967, we have seen in our cities a chain reaction of racial violence. If we are heedless, None of us shall escape its consequences. The rejection and protests. The causes of recent racial disorders are embedded in a tangle of issues and circumstances, social, economic, political, and psychological, which arise out of the historic pattern of Negro white relations in America. In this chapter, we trace the pattern, identify the recurrent themes of Negro protests, and, most importantly, provide a perspective on the protest activities of the present era. We describe the Negro's experience in America and the development of slavery as an institution. We show his persistent striving for equality in the face of rigidly maintained social, economic, and educational barriers and repeated mob violence. We portray the ebb and flow of doctrinal tides, accommodation, separatism, and self help, and their relationship to the current theme, Black Power. And we conclude Black Power advocates of today consciously feel that they are the most militant group in the Negro protest movement. Yet they have retreated from direct confrontation with American society on the issue of integration by preaching separatism, unconsciously functioning as an accommodation to white racism. Much of their economic program, as well as their interest in Negro history, self help, and racial solidarity and separation, is reminiscent of Booker T. Washington. The rhetoric is different, but the ideas are remarkably similar. Hmm. Throughout the 20th century, chapter 6, this is the formation of racial ghettos. Throughout the 20th century, the Negro population has been moving steadily from rural areas to urban and from the south to north and west. In 1910, 91% of the nation's 9.8 million Negroes lived in the South, and only 27% of American Negroes lived in cities of 2,500 persons or more. Between 1910 and 1966, the Negro population more than doubled, reaching 21.5 million. The number living in metropolitan areas rose more than fivefold, from 2.6 million to 14.8 million. The number outside the South rose 11-fold, from 885,000 to 9,700,000. The Negro migration from the South has resulted from the expectation of thousands and new highly paid jobs for unskilled workers in the North and the shift to mechanized farming in the South. However, the Negro migration is small when compared to the earlier waves of European migration. Even between 1960 and 1966, there were 1.8 million immigrants from abroad, compared to 613,000 Negroes who arrived in the North and West from the South. As a result, the growing number of Negroes in urban areas, natural increase, has replaced migration as the primary source of the Negro population increase in these cities. Nevertheless, Negro migration from the South will continue unless economic conditions there change dramatically. Basic data concerning Negro urbanization trends indicate that almost all Negro population growth, 98% from 1950 to 1966, is occurring within metropolitan areas, primarily within central cities. The vast majority of the white population growth, 78% from 1960 to 1966, is occurring in suburban portions of metropolitan areas. Since 1960, white central city population has declined by 1.3 million. As a result, central cities are becoming more heavily Negro, while the suburban fringes around them remain almost entirely white. 12 The 12 largest central cities now contain over two-thirds of the Negro population outside the South, almost one-third of the Negro total in the United States. Within the cities, Negroes have been excluded from white residential areas through discriminatory practices, just as significant as the withdrawal of white families or the refusal to enter neighborhoods where Negroes are moving or already residing. About 20% of the urban population of the United States changes residence every year. The refusal of whites to move into changing areas when vacancies occurs means that most vacancies eventually are occupied by Negroes. The result, according to the recent study, that in 1960 the average segregation index for 207 of the largest U.S. cities was 86.2%. In other words, to create an unsegregated population distribution, an average of over 86% of Negroes would have to change their places of residence within the city. Chapter 7: Unemployment and Family Structure and Social Disorganization. Although there have been gains for Negro income nationally and a decline with the number of Negroes living below the poverty level, the condition of Negroes in the central city remains in a state of crisis. Between 2 and 2.5 million Negroes, 16 to 20% of the total Negro population of all central cities, live in squalor and deprivation in ghetto neighborhoods. Employment is a key problem. Not only the not only the controls of the for the present. I'm sorry. It not only controls the present for the American Negro, but in the most profound way, it is creating a future as well. Yet, despite continuing economic growth and declining national unemployment rates, the unemployment rate for Negroes in 1967 was more than double that of whites. Equally important is the undesirable nature of many of the jobs open to Negroes and other minorities. Negro men are more than 3 times as likely as white men to be in low paying, unskilled, or service jobs. This concentration of the Negro male employment in the lowest end of the occupational scale is the single most important cause of poverty among Negroes. In one study, the low income neighborhoods, the subemployment rate, including both unemployment and underemployment, was about 33%, or 8.8 times greater than the overall unemployment rate for all U.S. workers. Employment problems aggravated by the constant arrival of new unemployed migrants, many of them from depressed rural areas, create persistent poverty in the ghetto. In 1966, 11.9% of the nation's whites and 40.6% of its non-whites were below the poverty level defined by the Social Security Administration. In 1966, $3,335 per year for an urban family of 4. Over 40% of the non-whites below the poverty level live in central cities. Employment problems have a drastic social impact in the ghetto. Men who are chronically unemployed or employed in the lowest status jobs are often unable or unwilling to remain with their families. The handicap imposed on children growing up without fathers in an atmosphere of deprivation is increased as mothers are forced to work to provide support. The culture of poverty that results from unemployment and family breakup generates a system of ruthless, exploitative relationships within the ghetto. Prostitution, dope addiction, and crime create an environmental jungle characterized by personal insecurity and tension. Children growing up under such conditions are likely to participate in civil disorders. Chapter 8: Conditions of Life in the Racial Ghetto. A striking difference in the environment from that of white middle class Americans profoundly influences the lives of residents of the ghetto. Crime rates consistently higher than in other areas create a pronounced sense of insecurity. For example, in one city, one low income Negro district had 35 times as many serious crimes as persons as a high income white district. Unless drastic steps are taken, the crime problems in poverty areas are likely to continue to multiply as the growing youth and up rapid urbanization of the population outstrip police resources. Poor health and sanitation conditions in the ghetto result in higher mortality rates, a higher incidence of major diseases, lower availability and utilization of medical services. The infant mortality rate for non white babies under the age of 1 month is 58% higher than for whites. For 1 to 12 months, it's almost 3 times as high. The level of sanitation in the ghetto is far below that of high income areas. Garbage collection is often inadequate. Of an estimated 14,000 cases of rat bite in the United States in 1965, most were in ghetto neighborhoods. Ghetto residents believe they're exploited by local merchants, and evidence substantiates some of these beliefs. A study conducted by one city by the Federal Trade Commission showed higher prices were charged for goods sold in ghetto stores than in other areas. The lack of knowledge regarding credit purchasing creates special pitfalls for disadvantaged. In many states, garnishment of practices compound these difficulties by allowing creditors to deprive individuals of their wages without a hearing or trial. 9. Comparing immigrants to Negro experiences. In this chapter, we address ourselves to a fundamental question that many white Americans are asking. Why have so many Negroes, unlike European immigrants, been unable to escape from the ghetto and from poverty? We believe the following factors play a part. The maturing economy. When the European immigrants arrived, they gained an economic foothold by providing the unskilled labor needed by industry. Unlike the immigrants, the Negro migrants found little opportunity in the city. The economy, by then it matured, had little use for the unskilled labor that he had to offer. Disability of race. The structural discrimination has stringently narrowed opportunities for the Negro and restricted his prospects. European immigrants suffered from discrimination, but never so pervasively. Entry into the political system. Immigrants usually settled into rapidly growing cities with powerful and expanding political machines, which traded economic advantages for political support. Ward level grievance machinery, as well as personal representation, enabled immigrants to make his voice heard and his power felt. By the time the Negro arrived, the political machines were no longer so powerful or so well equipped to provide jobs or other favors, and in many cases were unwilling to share the remaining influence with Negroes. Cultural factors. Coming from societies with low standard of living and at a time where job aspirations were low, immigrants sensed little deprivation and being forced to live in less desirable, poorer paying jobs. Their large, cohesive families contributed to a total income. Their vision of the future, one that led to life outside the ghetto, provided incentive necessary to endure the present. Though Negro men have worked as hard as the immigrants, they were unable to support their families. The entrepreneurial opportunities had vanished. As a result of slavery and long periods of unemployment, the Negro family structure had become matriarchal. The males played a secondary and marginal family role, one which offered little compensation for their hard and unrewarding labor. Above all, segregation denied the Negro access to good jobs and the opportunity to leave the ghetto. For them, the future only seemed to lead to a dead end. Today, whites tend to exaggerate how well and how quickly they escape from poverty. The fact is that immigrants who came from rural backgrounds, as many Negroes do, are only now, after 3 generations, finally beginning to move into the middle class. By contrast, the Negroes began concentrating in the city less than 2 generations ago and under much less favorable conditions. Although some Negroes have escaped poverty, few have been able to escape the urban ghetto. Chapter 10. What can be done? Community response. Our investigation of the 1967 riot establishes that virtually every major episode of violence was foreshadowed by an accumulation of unresolved grievances and widespread dissatisfaction among Negroes with the unwillingness or inability of the local government to respond. Overcoming these conditions is essential for the community's support of law enforcement and civil order. City governments need new and more vital channels of communication to the residents of the ghetto. They need to improve their capacity to respond effectively to community needs before they become community grievances. And they need to provide opportunity for meaningful involvement of ghetto residents in shaping policies and programs which affect the community. The commission recommends the following: that the local governments do this: develop neighborhood action task forces as a joint community government effort through which more effective communication can be achieved, and the delivery of civil services to ghetto residents improved. Establish comprehensive grievance response mechanisms in order to bring all public agencies under public scrutiny, to bring the institutions of local government closer to the people they serve by establishing neighborhood outlets, the local, state, and federal administrative and public service agencies, expand opportunities for ghetto residents to participate in the formulation of public policy and the implementation of programs affecting them through improved political representation, creation of institutional channels for community action, expansion of legal services, legislative hearings on ghetto problems. In this effort, city governments will require state and federal support. The Commission recommends that state and federal financial assistance for mayors and city councils to support the research, consultants, and staff and other resources needed to respond effectively to the federal program initiatives. State cooperation in the providing municipalities with the jurisdictional tools needed to deal with their problems in a fuller measure of financial aid to urban areas, and the focusing of interest in suburban communities on the physical, social, and cultural environment of the central city. 11. Police in the community. Oh, here we go. The abrasive relationship between the police and minority communities has been a major and explosive source of grievance, tension, and disorder. The blame must be shared by the total society. The police are faced with demands for increased protection and service in the ghetto, yet the aggressive patrol practices thought necessary to meet these demands themselves create tension and hostility. The resulting grievances have been further aggravated by the lack of effective mechanisms for handling complaints against the police. Special programs for bettering police community relations have been instituted, but these alone are not enough. Police administrators, with guidance of public officials and the support of the entire community, must take vigorous action to improve law enforcement and to decrease the potential for disorder. The Commission recommends that the city government and police authorities: 1. Review police operations in the ghetto to ensure proper conduct by police officers and to eliminate abrasive practices. Provide more police protection of ghetto residents to eliminate their high sense of insecurity and their belief in a dual standard of law enforcement. Establish fair and effective mechanisms to for the redress of grievances against the police and municipal employees. Develop and adopt policy guidelines to assist officers in making critical decisions in areas where the police conduct can create tension. Develop and use innovative programs to ensure widespread community support for law enforcement. Recruit more Negroes into regular police force and review promotion policies to ensure fair promotion for Negro officers. Establish a community service officer program to attract ghetto youth between the ages of 17 and 21 to police work. These junior officers would perform duties in ghetto neighborhoods, but would not have full police authority. The federal government should provide support equal to 90% of the cost of employing CSOs on the basis of one for every 10 regular officers. 12. Control of disorder. Preserving the civil peace is the first responsibility of government. Unless the rule of law prevails, our society will lack not only order, but the environment essential to social and economic progress. The maintenance of civil order cannot be left to the police alone. The police need guidance as well as support from mayors and other public officials. It is the responsibility of public officials to determine the proper police policies, support adequate police standards for personnel and performance, and to participate in planning for the control of disorders. To maintain the control of incidents which lead to disorders, the Commission recommends that local officials assign seasoned, well-trained policemen to the supervisory officers to patrol ghetto areas to respond to disturbances. Develop plans which would quickly muster maximum police manpower and highly qualified senior commanders at the outbreak of disorders. Provide special training in the prevention of disorders and prepare police riot control for operation in units with adequate command and control and field communication for proper discipline and effectiveness. Develop guidelines governing the use of control equipment and provide alternatives to the use of lethal weapons. Federal support and research in this area is needed. To establish an intelligence system to provide the police and other public officials with reliable information that would help prevent outbreaks of a disorder and institute effective control measures in the event a riot erupts. Develop a continuing contacts in the ghetto with ghetto residents to make use of forces and order which exist within the community. Establish machinery for neutralizing rumors and enabling Negro leaders and residents to obtain the facts. Create a special rumor detail to collect, evaluate, and dispel rumors that may lead to civil disorder. The Commission believes that there's a grave danger that in some communities may resort to indiscriminate and excessive use of force. The harming effect of overreactions are incalculable. The Commission condemns moves to equip the police departments with mass destruction weapons such as automatic rifles, machine guns, tanks. Weapons which are designed to destroy, not to control, have no place in densely populated urban communities. The Commission commends that the federal government share in the financing of programs for the improvement of police forces, both in their normal law enforcement activities as well as their response to civil disorders. To assist government authorities in planning their response to civil disorder, this report contains a supplemental on control disorder. It deals with specific programs encountered during riot control operations, and it includes an assessment of the present capabilities of police, National Guard, and Army forces to control major riots, and recommendations for improvement. Recommended means by which the control operation of those forces may be coordinated with the response of other agencies, such as fire departments, and with the community at large. Recommendation for the review of the revision of federal, state, and local laws needed to provide the framework for control efforts and for call up of interrelated action of public safety forces. 13. The administration of justice under emergency conditions. In many of the cities which experienced disorders last summer, there were recurring breakdowns in the mechanism for processing, prosecuting, and protecting arrested persons. These resulted mainly from long-standing structural deficiencies in the criminal court systems and from the failure of communities to participate in the plan for emergency demands of civil disorders. In part because of this, there are few successful prosecutions for serious crimes committed during the riots. In those cities where mass arrests occurred, many arrestees were deprived of basic rights. The Commission recommends that the cities and states undertake reform of the lower courts as to improve the quality of justice rendered under normal conditions, Plan comprehensive measures by which the criminal justice system may be supplemented during civil disorders so that its deliberative functions are protected and the quality of justice is maintained. Such emergencies require board community participation and dedicated leadership by the bench and bar. They should include law sufficient to deter and punish riot conduct, additional judges, bail and probation officers, and clerical staff, the arrangement for volunteer lawyers to help prosecutors and to represent riot defendants at every stage of the proceedings, policies to ensure proper and individual bail, arraignment, pretrial, trial, and sentencing procedures, adequate emergency processing and detention facilities. 14. Damage control. Damage repair, sorry. Damage repair and compensation. The Commission recommends the federal government amend the Federal Disaster Act, which applies not only to natural disasters, to permit federal emergency food and medical assistance to cities during major civil disorders and to provide long-term economic assistance afterwards, with cooperation of the states to create incentives for the private insurance industry to provide more adequate property insurance coverage in low-income areas. The Commission endorses the National Advisory Panel on the Insurance in Riot-Affected Areas, meeting the insurance crisis of our cities. Chapter 15, News, Media, and Disorders. In his charge to the Commission, the President asked, what effect does mass media have on the riots? The Commission determined that the answer to the President's question did not lie solely with the performance of the press and broadcasters in reporting the riots. Our analysis had to consider the overall treatment of the media of the Negro ghettos, community relations, racial attitudes, and poverty, day by day, month by month, and year in and year out. A wide range of interviews with government officials, law enforcement authorities, media personnel, and other citizens, including ghetto residents, as well as qualitative analysis of riot coverage and a special conference with industry representatives led us to conclude that despite instances of sensationalism, inaccuracy, and distortion, newspaper, radio, and television tried on a whole to give balanced, factual accounts of the 1967 disorders. Elements of the news media failed to portray accurately the scale and character of the violence that occurred that summer. The overall effect was, we believe, an exaggeration of both mood and event. Important segments of the media failed to report adequately on the causes and consequences of civil disorders and on the underlying problems of race relations. They have not communicated to the majority of their audience, which is white, a sense of the degradation, misery, and hopelessness of life in the ghetto. These failings must be corrected. The improvement must come from within the industry. Freedom of press is not the issue. Any effort to impose governmental restrictions would be inconsistent with the fundamental constitutional precepts. We have seen evidence that the news media are becoming aware and concerned about their performance in this field. As that concern grows, coverage will improve, but much more must be done, and it must be done soon. The Commission recommends that the media expand the coverage of the Negro community and race problems through permanent assignments of reporters familiar with urban and racial affairs and through the establishment of more and better links with the Negro community. Integrate Negroes and Negro activities into all aspects of coverage and content, including newspaper articles, television programming. News media must publish newspapers and produce programs that recognize existence and activities of Negroes as a group within the community and as part of the larger community. Recruit more Negroes into journalism and broadcasting, and promote those who are qualified to positions of significant responsibility. Recruitment should begin in high schools and continue through college, where necessary training aid. Through college where necessary, aid for training should be provided. improve the coordination with the police and reporting riot news through advanced planning and cooperation with the police and the designation of police information officers, establishment of information centers, and the development of mutually acceptable guidelines for riot reporting and the conduct of media personnel. To accelerate efforts to ensure accurate and responsible reporting of riot and racial news through the adoption by all news gathering organizations of stringent internal staff guidelines. Cooperate in the establishment of privately organized funding Institute of Urban Communications to train and educate journalists in urban affairs, recruit and train more Negro journalists, develop methods of improving police press relations, review coverage of riots and racial issues, and support continuing research in the urban field. The future of cities. I'm going to stop here and go to another book, but uh, hold on, let me see something. No, I may do some more. Hold on. By 1985, the Negro population in central cities is expected to increase by 68% to 20.3 million. Coupled with the continued exodus of white families to the suburbs, this growth will produce majority black populations in many of the nation's largest cities. The future of these cities and their burgeoning Negro populations is grim. Most new employment opportunities are being created in suburbs and outlying areas. This trend will continue unless important changes in public policy are made. In prospect, therefore, the further deterioration is already inadequate municipal tax base in face of increasing demands for public services and continuing unemployment and poverty among urban Negro population. Three choices are open to the nation. We can maintain the present policies containing both the proportion of the nation's resources now allocated to programs for the unemployed and disadvantaged and the inadequate failing effort to achieve an integrated society. We can adopt a policy of enrichment aimed at improving dramatically the quality of ghetto life while abandoning integration as a goal. We can pursue integration by combining ghetto enrichment with policies which will encourage Negro movement out of the central city areas. The first choice, the continuance of present policies, has ominous consequences for our society. The share of this nation's resources now allocated to the programs for disadvantaged is insufficient to arrest the deterioration of life in central city ghettos. Under such conditions, a rising proportion of Negroes may come to see in deprivation and segregation they experience as a justification for violent protest or for extending support for now isolated extremists who advocate for civil disruption. Large scale and continuing violence could result, followed by white retaliation and ultimately the separation of the two communities in a garrison state. Even if violence does not occur, the consequences are unacceptable. Development of a racially integrated society, extraordinarily difficult today, would be virtually impossible when the present black central city population of 12 million has grown to almost 21 million. To continue the present policies is to make the permanent division of our country into two societies, one largely Negro and poor, located in central cities, and the other predominantly white and affluent, located in the suburbs and outlying areas. The second choice, ghetto enrichment coupled with the abandonment of integration, is also unacceptable. It is another way of choosing a permanently divided country. Moreover, equality cannot be achieved under conditions of nearly complete separation. In a country where the economy, particularly the resources of employment, are predominantly white, a policy of separation can only relegate Negroes to a permanently inferior economic status. We believe the only possible choice for America is the third, a policy which combines ghetto enrichment with the programs designed to encourage the integration of substantial numbers of Negroes into society outside the ghetto. Enrichment must be an important adjunct to integration, for no matter how ambitious or energetic the program, few Negroes now living in the central cities can be quickly integrated. In the meantime, large scale improvement in the quality of the ghetto life is essential. But this cannot be no more than an interim strategy. Programs must be developed which will permit substantial movement out of the ghettos. Negro movement out of the ghettos, the primary goal must be a single society in which every citizen will live free and work according to his capabilities and desires, not his color. Chapter 17, Recommendations for National Action. No American, black or white, can escape the consequences of the continuing social and economic decay of our major cities. Only a commitment to national action on an unprecedented scale can shape a future compatible with the historic ideals of American society. The great productivity of our economy and our Federal Reserve System, which is highly responsive to economic growth, can provide the resources. The major need is to generate a new will, the will to tax ourselves to the extent necessary to meet the vital needs of the nation. We have set forth goals and proposed strategies to reach these goals. We discuss and recommend programs, not to commit each of us to specific parts of such programs, but to illustrate the types and dimensions of the action needed. The major goal is the creation of a true union, a single society, a single American identity. Toward that goal, we propose the following objectives for national action: opening up opportunities to those who are restricted by racial segregation and discrimination, and eliminating all barriers to their choice of jobs, education, and housing; removing the frustration of powerlessness among the disadvantaged by providing the means for them to deal with the problems that affect their own lives, and by increasing the capacity of our public and private institutions to respond to these problems; increasing the communication across racial lines to destroy stereotypes, halt polarization, end distrust and hostility, and create common ground for efforts towards public order and social justice. We propose these aims will fulfill our pledge of equality and to meet the fundamental needs of a democratic and civilized society, domestic peace, and social justice. Pervasive unemployment and underemployment are the most persistent and serious grievances in minority areas. They are inextricably linked to the problem of civil disorder. Despite growing federal expenditures for manpower development and training programs and sustained general economic prosperity and increasing demand for skilled workers, about 2 million white and non white are permanently unemployed. About 10 million are underemployed, of whom 6.5 million work full time for wages below the poverty line. Of the half million hardcore unemployed in the central cities who lack basic education, are unable to hold a steady job, are made up in a large part by the Negro males between the ages of 18 and 25. In the riot cities in which we surveyed, the Negroes were 3 times as likely as whites to hold unskilled jobs, which were often part time, seasonal, low paying, and dead end. Negro males between the ages of 15 and 25 predominated among these rioters. More than 20% of the rioters were unemployed, and many who were unemployed held intermittent, low status, unskilled jobs which they regarded as below their education ability. The Commission recommends that the federal government undertake joint efforts with cities and states to consolidate the existing manpower programs to avoid the fragmentation and duplication, to take immediate action to create 2 million new jobs over the next 3 years, 1 million in the public sector and 1 million in the private sector, to absorb the hardcore unemployed and materially reduce the level of unemployment for all workers, black and white. We propose 250,000 public sector and 300,000 private sector jobs in the first year. provide on-the-job training by both public and private employers with reimbursement to private employers for the extra costs of training the hardcore unemployed by contract or tax credits, provide tax and other incentives to the investment in rural as well as urban poverty areas in order to offer the rural poor an alternative to migration to the urban centers. Take new and vigorous actions to remove artificial barriers to employment and promotion, including not only racial discrimination, but in certain cases, arrest records or a lack of a high school diploma. Strengthen those agencies such as the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, charged with eliminating discriminatory practices, and provide a full report of Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, allowing federal grants and aid funds to be withheld from activities which discriminate on the grounds of color or race. The Commission commends the recent public commitment of the National Council of Building and Construction Trades Union, AFL-CIO, to encourage and recruit Negro membership and apprenticeship programs. This commitment should be intensified and implemented. Education and a democratic society must equip children to develop their potential and to participate fully in American life. For the community at large, schools have discharged this responsibility well. But for many minorities, particularly children of the ghetto, the schools have failed to provide the educational experience which could overcome the effects of discrimination and deprivation. This failure is one of the persistent sources of grievance and resentment within the Negro community. The hostility of Negro parents and students toward the school system is generating conflict and causing disruption within many school districts, but the most dramatic evidence of the relationship between the educational practices and the civil disorders lies in the high incidence of riot participation by ghetto youth who have not completed high school. The bleak record of public education of ghetto children is growing worse. In critical skills, verbal and reading ability, Negro students are falling further behind whites each year of school completed. High unemployment and underemployment rate of Negro youth is evidence and part of the growing educational crisis. We support integration as a priority education strategy. It is essential for the future of American society. In this last summer's disorders, we have seen the consequences of racial isolation at all levels and of attitudes towards race on both sides produced by 3 centuries of myth, ignorance, and bias. It is indispensable that opportunities for interaction between the races be expanded. We recognize that the growing dominance of pupils from disadvantaged minorities in city school populations will not soon be reversed. No matter how great the effort towards desegregation, many children of the ghetto will not, within their school careers, attend integrated schools. If existing disadvantages are not to be perpetuated, we must drastically improve the quality of ghetto education. Equality of results with all white schools must be the goal. To implement these strategies, the Commission recommends sharply increased efforts to eliminate de facto segregation in our schools through substantial federal aid to school systems seeking to desegregate either within the system or in cooperation with neighboring school systems. The elimination of racial discrimination in northern as well as southern schools by vigorous application of the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Extension of quality early child education to every disadvantaged child in the country. Efforts to improve schools serving disadvantaged children through substantial federal funding of year-round quality compensatory education programs, improved teaching, and expanded experimentation and research. Elimination of illiteracy through a federal support for adult basic education. Enlarge opportunity for parent and community participation in public schools. Reorient vocational education, emphasizing work experience training and the involvement of the business and industry. expanded opportunities for higher education through the increased federal assistance to disadvantaged students, revision of state aid formulas to assure more per student aid districts having a high proportion of disadvantaged school age children, our present system of public welfare to save money instead of people practically ends up doing neither. This system has two critical deficiencies. First, it excludes large numbers of persons who are in great need and who, if provided a decent level of support, might be able to become more productive and self sufficient. No federal funds are available for millions of unemployed and underemployed men and women who are needy but neither age, handicapped, nor parents of minor children. Second, for those included, the system provides assistance well below the minimum necessary for a decent level of existence and imposes restrictions that encourage continued dependency on welfare and undermine self respect. A welter of statutory requirements and administrative practices and regulations operate to remind the recipients that they are considered untrustworthy, promiscuous, and lazy. Residence requirements prevent assistance to people in need who are newly arrived in the state. Searches of recipients' homes violate privacy. Inadequate social services compound the problems. The Commission recommends that the federal government, acting with state and local government, where necessary, reform existing welfare system to do. Establish for recipients and existing welfare categories a uniform national standards of assistance at least as high as the annual poverty level of income now set by the Social Security Administration of $3,335 a year. Require that all states receiving federal welfare contributions participate in the Aid to Families with Dependent Children Unemployed Parents Program, AFDCUP, that permits assistance to families with both father and mother in the home, thus aiding the family while it is still intact. Bear substantially greater portion of all welfare costs, at least 90% of the total payments. Increase incentives for seeking employment and job training, but removing restrictions from recently enacted by Congress would compel mothers of young children to work. Provide more adequate social services through neighborhood centers and family planning programs. Remove the freeze placed on the 1967 Welfare Amendment on the percentage of children in the state that can be covered by federal assistance. Eliminate residence requirements. As a long-range goal, the Commission recommends that the federal government seek to develop a national system of income supplementation based strictly on need with two broad basic purposes: to provide for those who can work or who do work with necessary supplements in such a way as to develop incentives for full employment, to provide for those who cannot work and for mothers who decide to remain with their children a minimum standard of decent living, to aid in saving the children from from the prison of poverty that has held their parents. A broad system of supplementation would involve substantially greater federal expenditures than anything now contemplated. The costs will range widely depending on the standard of need accepted as the basic allowance to individuals and families, and at the rate in which additional income above this level is taxed. Yet, if this deepening cycle of poverty and dependence on welfare can be broken, if the children of the poor can be given the opportunity to scale the wall that separates them from the rest of society, the return on this investment will be great indeed. Housing. For more than 3 decades of fragmented and grossly underfunded federal housing programs, nearly 6 million substandard housing units remain occupied in the United States. The housing problem is particularly acute in minority ghettos. Nearly two-thirds of all non-white families living in the central city today live in neighborhoods marked by substandard housing and general urban blight. Two major factors are responsible. First, many urban many ghetto residents simply cannot pay the rent necessary to support decent housing. In Detroit, for example, over 40% of the non-white occupied units in the 1960 rent of over 35% of the tenant's income. Second, discrimination prevents access to many non slum areas, particularly the suburbs where good housing exists. In addition, by creating back pressure in the racial ghettos, it makes it possible for landlords to break up apartments for denser occupancy and keeps prices and rents of the deteriorated ghetto housing higher than it would be in a truly free market. To date, the federal programs have been able to do comparatively little to provide housing for the disadvantaged. In the 31 years of the subsidized federal housing, only 800,000 units have been constructed, with a decent production averaging 50,000 units a year. By comparison, over a period of only 3 years longer, the FHA insurance guarantees have made possible the construction of over 10 million middle and upper income units. 2 points of fundamental central to the Commission's recommendations. First, federal housing programs must be given new thrust aimed at overcoming the prevailing patterns of racial segregation. If this is not done, those programs will continue to concentrate the most impoverished and dependent segments of the population in central city ghettos where there's already a critical gap between need of the population and the public resources to deal with them. Second, the private sector must be brought into production and financing of low and moderate rental housing to supply the capabilities of capital necessary to meet the housing needs of the nation. The Federal Commission recommends that the federal government enact comprehensive and enforceable federal open housing law to cover the sale and rental of all housing, including single-family homes, reorient federal housing programs to place more low and moderate income housing outside of ghetto areas, bring within reach of low and moderate income families within the next 5 years, 6 million new existing units of housing, beginning with 6,000 units in the next year. To reach this goal, we recommend an expansion modification of the rent supplementation program to permit the use of supplements for existing housing, thus greatly increasing the reach of the program. Expansion and modification of the below market interest rate program to enlarge the interest subsidy to all the sponsors, provide the interest-free loans to the nonprofit sponsors to cover the pre-construction costs, and permit the sale of the projects to nonprofit corporations, cooperatives, or condominiums. The creation of an ownership supplement program similar to present rent supplements to make home ownership possible for low-income families. Federal write-down of interest rates on loans to private builders constructing moderate rent housing. Expansion of public housing program with the emphasis on small units and scattered sites, and leasing the turnkey program expansion. Turnkey programs. Expansion of the Model Cities program, expansion and reorientation of the urban renewal program to give priority to projects directly assisting low-income households to obtain adequate housing. Conclusion. Oh my, we're almost there. One of the first witnesses to be invited before the commission was Dr. Kenneth Clark, a distinguished and perceptive scholar. Referring to the reports of the earlier riot commission, he said, "I read that report of the 1919 riot in Chicago, and it was as if I were reading the report of the investigative committee of the Harlem riot of 1935, the report of the investigating committee of the Harlem riot of 1943, and the report of the McCone Commission on the Watts riot. I must again in candor say to you, members of this commission, it is kind of Alice in Wonderland with the same moving picture reshown over and over again with the same analysis, the same recommendations, the same inaction. These words come to our mind as we conclude this report. We have provided an honest beginning. We have learned much, but we have uncovered No startling truths, no unique insights, no simple solution. The destruction and bitterness of the racial disorder, the harsh polemics of the black revolt and white repression have seen and heard before this country. The time is now to end the destruction and the violence, not only in the streets of the ghetto, but in the lives of people. Hmm. So I got through the summary. Hmm. Let me see. I don't know. Hold 1 second. So I got that. I'm gonna look and see what my supporting books do. How is everybody? What time is it? It's 1:48. Yeah, still up in here. About 24:14. Hmm. 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 I'm gonna do this one. Give me a second. I'm trying to think which one I want to do. Hmm. Hmm. I don't. I want to do 6. I'm going to do a piece of the harvest of American racism, because it's a nice, quick read. I'll get through it, and it'll be cool. And this is all dealing with the '60s. And I'm saying to everybody listening, if you're not looking at how mad people are, we're in very dangerous times here in the States. I don't want anyone to pop anyone in the head. I absolutely never, ever, ever, ever am recommending that people do stuff. I'm absolutely very interested in people being calm, cool, and collected. I don't want anybody doing anything dumb, but I am saying that there's a tension out here. There's a serious tension, and it's very important. It's very important that people open their eyes and actually get ready. Try to do. Try to do. Be peaceful, but also protect yourself. Don't let nobody mess over you. I see a nice chapter here. And a lot of these all deal with black folk getting fed up, and a lot of stuff is going to piss people off. And I'm telling you, next week, as much as I'm not pleased with Diddy, um, these people have a lot of nerve, and we're dealing in a situation where, uh, and bear with me, I'm just trying to see the best way because I don't want to read the whole thing. Mhm. Hmm. If any of you were alive back in the day, they were very scary times, and I think we're going into. We have a very weird thing coming, and we have some very stupid people. They're dumb. They don't have good sense. They have no idea. Okay, I'm gonna go with this one instead, and maybe I'll add on to it because this has some pieces in it. So if y'all up to it. I think I'm gonna give it another hour. This is chapter 7. I like. Um, mhm, mhm. I'm looking at chapter 7. Okay, I love this. This. Okay, let's get down to business. I like 3 and 7. And this 3. This 3 speaks to right now, y'all. I'm gonna just go ahead and pull this up because I think we can roll. We can rock 3 and we can rock 7. Okay. This is the editor is Robert Shello, and this is the Harvest of American Racism. Again, I'm gonna show y'all this. Check it out, and I'm going to. The 2 chapters I want to look at. I may do more, and I may even look to back in the Kerner, but I want to read this one because this is where the problem's going to come from. Young people are tired, and this is crazy. So I'm in chapter 3. This is a social and political background of violence. The disturbances of the summer of 1967 are different from one another in many ways, but they also have many features in common. One of the most significant of these is the fact that almost in all the disturbances, Negro youth and young adults in the age range from 15 to 30 have played a predominant role. And some, this tendency towards involvement of youth has been so pronounced that few participants are over the age of 21, and a good many are in the 12 to 15 age range. When it is recognized the average age of most of the country's ghettos is under 20 years, the extensive participation of youth in the riots becomes more significant. The average citizen of the ghetto is about 20 years old, and so is the average rioter. In terms of both the numbers and initiative, the Negro youth constitute a profound social force in the ghettos. The fact, this fact cannot be overemphasized since there's a radical break in the continuity between today's Negro youth and their parents. Though certain, eh, though certainly a feature of white society, this gap is much more pronounced among Negroes. Negro youth are rejecting the compromises and subservience of their elders and developing a racial pride that has probably at this point become self sustaining. Consequently, they make greater demands upon the larger society and press them with more vigor, and on a whole, society has not responded. Despite their importance as a social force, Negro youth have almost no access to the established political system. The same, of course, could be said of white youth, but as noted, there's less generational gap among whites than among Negroes. Despite the student protests in the universities, white youth, much more than Negroes, are willing to accept a society that others before them have fashioned. The Negro representation in politics, with few exceptions, the monopoly of older men, almost all of them of middle class, they do not and perhaps cannot represent the interests of Negro youth. The classic conditions of rebellion are thus evident in the ghettos of today. A major social force, independent in its thinking, imaginative and ready to take the initiative, and increasingly aware of its own potential, is virtually locked out of political power. When established political relations no longer reflect the predominant social forces, a rising class, in this case Negro youth, is inclined to take matters into their own hands. The rejection of moderate and established Negro leadership by youth reflect a common pattern in the development of social movements. In colonial countries, for example, the old nationalist leadership, intent on maintaining good relations with the metropolitan power while pressing slowly for independence, was swept aside after World War II as the movement acquired its mass base. New leaders demanded immediate independence and were much less amenable to working within the established system to achieve their aims. In some colonies, the metropolitan got out in time to avoid massive bloodshed. In others, a revolutionary underground developed. Still others, there was widespread rioting against the colonizers. For militant and aggressive Negro youths, the local anti poverty agencies up till now have provided one of the few channels of access to authority, and this may well have been their most important function. As the poverty program applies to the ghettos, it might be more realistic to stress maximum feasible participation of the young than the poor, because the poor, as such, are not much of a social force, the young are. Adequate representation of the interests of Negro youth would, in itself, have some value, as it would accord recognition and legitimacy, but there are obvious limits to the value of representation alone. For as established Negro leaders have discovered, the most ordinary demands of pluralistic politics, when made by a Negro representative, can become a racial issue. A routine matter such as the city council vote on paving a street ceases to be a discrete item in the bargaining process and becomes part of the larger issue, whether or not whites are giving too much to Negro demands. Under these circumstances, agreeing to pave a street may seem as an opening wedge in an endless series of demands by people who are not really part of the game anyway. Since whites are on the council and are invariably the majority, they can close ranks along racial lines and reject the demand. Since the riot started in 1964, the action of Negro participants, youthful Negro participants, have become more pointed and more political. In that year, riots were mainly negative reactions to the instances of perceived police misconduct and the circumstances of ghetto life in general. In subsequent years, Negro demands have increasingly become incorporated in the riots themselves, and, as has been pointed out earlier, instances of bargaining between rioters and authorities has grown in number as have attacks on public buildings. And I think what's going to happen here is you're going to see young black folks who don't like these old sellout Democrats, they're men and women. Um, this is talking about several cities. This is Table 6. As indicated by Table 6, six disturbances occurring during the summer of 67 had a marked component, Detroit and Newark. This component is less visible in the other cities because of the magnitude and complexity of the events, but it is there nonetheless. To take one indication, a study of riot participants conducted by the University of Michigan concluded after extensive interviews that in Detroit, the rioters were much more likely to than non-whites consider the failure of the political structure as a major cause um, of the rioting. A comparison of the cities that had political disturbances with those in which events were more diffuse and expressive indicates that political disorders are more likely to take place in cities that have a sizable Negro middle class. This was true in five of the six cities with pronounced political disturbances, the most notable exception being Newark. Four cities whose disorders, some political content, also had a sizable Negro middle class. With the exception of Newark again, the political disturbances took place in a fairly stable Negro neighborhoods where the rate of unemployment was relatively low, income and education relatively high. In 1960, the income for Negroes in Englewood, New Jersey, for example, was 5,700, the highest of any Negro community in the metropolitan area. In Detroit, the center of the fiercest activity in the riot was the upper middle class neighborhood and had a significant of most of the rioting took place in the more stable, economically secure West Side ghetto rather than the depressed East Side. Why have political riots occurred in cities with sizable Negro middle class? It is difficult to be certain, but several reasons may be suggested. Because of its educated, articulate, and involved in political activities, the middle class tends to raise the level of political awareness in the Negro community. This is especially true in the case of Negro militants and activists, for the most part disaffected members of the middle class. Furthermore, the presence of a large middle class means that Negro political representation in that city may be in the hands of old established leadership that blocks the access of militant youth to the political process. Finally, because of the level of education and political awareness in the class, the involvement of a significant number of middle class Negroes, especially youth, in a riot may well help it turn into a political direction. The uneducated and unemployed usually lack the perspective necessary to give a riot political focus. Without exception, ghettos that have political disturbances were characterized by a considerable degree of political awareness before the outbreaks, and most of them were quite militant. Newark has been in the center of black nationalist activity in the country for several years. As far back as 1963, Mayor Kavanaugh flew home to Detroit on a moment's notice to lead a massive civil rights demonstration of 200,000 marchers because he feared, this is the march with Aretha Franklin's daddy and Dr. King, because he feared that otherwise the demonstration would fall in the hands of black radicals. Cincinnati has a good deal of nationalistic activity, and in all of these cities, militant Negro youth have been generating political issues which confront authorities. School issues have been among the most prominent ones raised by Negro youths. Young Detroit Negroes boycotted Northern High School and the ghetto after the white principal disciplined the editor of the school newspaper for printing editorials critical of the administration. In Plainfield, New Jersey, Negro students boycotted the school cafeteria. In another incident, some of them carried on a campaign of intimidation against white students after a white teacher was thought to treat a Negro student unfairly. In New Brunswick, youthful rioters demanded a number of Negro students expelled by a prejudiced principal be reinstated. The demand was met. The number of confrontations in public schools between black and white students and between black students and school authorities has increased rapidly in the past few years. These confrontations are part of the larger tendency of Negro youth to challenge both white authority and white society as a whole. Of the six disturbances with important political component, those in Detroit, Newark, and Cincinnati, and to a lesser extent Plainfield, were intensively violent and involved the participation of many whose motives were not political. Those in New Brunswick and Englewood were low intensity incidents, clear cut in terms of the action of the participants, and characterized by a high degree of political rationality. The difference between these two types of political disorders probably stem from the fact that New Brunswick and Englewood do not have a large Negro underclass to disrupt the political niceties of these two very formal disturbances. Plainfield does have something of an underclass to judge from the poverty statistics, and a good many of its members participated in the biggest night of rioting, thus compromising the clear-cut form of events that would have otherwise it had. Moreover, in these three small communities, there is not a diversity of social types as found in the large and most large cities. Consequently, the riots in large cities, Cincinnati, Newark, and Detroit, were messier and more complex than those in the three New Jersey towns. As observed, political riots are more likely to take place in cities that have an established middle class and in areas that are relatively stable, moderately well off, and solid working class and above. They're more likely to take place where most Negro residents are either both raised in the North. These Northerners have been quicker than their Southern counterparts to reject the old attitudes of subservience and racial inferiority. In three of the four cities that had disturbances with some political content, Atlanta, Dayton, and New Haven, an interesting pattern of development is evident. Atlanta's first and second disturbances in the summer of '66 took place in two of the poorest and least stable communities in the city, Summerhill and Boulevard. In the summer of '67, the site of the disturbance moved to the Dixie Hill area, which is more stable and less impoverished than either Summerhill or Boulevard. And this fall, another disturbance occurred, this time in Vine City, a stable and moderately well-to-do section. And Dayton, participation in three disturbances since the summer of 1966 has moved away from involvement by a small, disorganized barroom crowd towards activity by Negro youth who are becoming increasingly political. In New Haven, even though the course of one disturbance, the trouble starting the poorest and least stable neighborhood, Negro section of the town, the Hill area, spread to the more established Negro neighborhoods. Common to all three cases is the movement upwards in the socioeconomic position of the participants, suggesting that the political component in each may be increasing. Non-political disturbances usually take place in ghettos or ghetto areas that are poor, unstable, and southern in composition. They are now ghettos which sprang up largely after the Second World War. The Negro population of Milwaukee, to cite one case, increased tenfold since 1940. Migrants in the new ghettos move into areas which there are few established patterns for daily urban life. First, the migrants find few, if any, kinfolks to help them along. Under these circumstances, the Negro communities are slow to develop, and the ghettos in question become repositories for the dislocated and disfranchised. Militancy and race pride, like community, were slow to develop. Apathy and resignation are prevalent. Many Negro residents in these areas lack the perspective necessary for political consciousness. Consequently, the uprisings that take place there, while gut reaction is perceived in real injustices, are likely to be expressive outbursts with a large admixture of opportunism. They have minimal common solidarity and deliberateness and are likely to spend themselves in a short time. The position of a city's most powerful group on race appears to be a significant determinant in the character of ghetto violence. Table 2 correlates to the racial stance of the elites, their willingness to accommodate racial change with a degree of intensity and political content in different disorders. A major point to emerge from this categorization is that racially conservative cities have had a disproportionate number of low level disturbances, none that are either very intense or highly political. Moderate cities, on the other hand, have had disproportionate number of high intensity, highly political disturbances. The implication is that consistent repressiveness of the conservative cities inhibits ghetto violence, whereas the middling position of the moderate city permits it. Part of the problem is moderation in cities doesn't always signify the presence of a consistent position on racial matters, often the product of a jumble of contradictory tendencies that emerge in different ways at different times, conveying an impression that local government is erratic and unstable. Newark's mayor, after being elected with substantial Negro support, began shifting his political base to the Italian minority, of which he is a member. Newark's police department is reactionary and racist. The city's poverty program, progressive and liberal. Cincinnati's business elite is paternalistic. Its police department fairly liberal. In a recent referendum, Cincinnatians voted to establish at-large elections. The net effect was to decrease the number of Negro representatives in local government. Atlanta's liberal progressive facade covers massive edifice of segregation. One might say Atlanta is Birmingham with clothes on. Negro expectations are likely to be higher in a moderate liberal city than a conservative one. Negroes are more likely to be represented in local government, and the significance of which not. I got that right. The significance of the latter for ghetto violence is that it combines an illusion of progress, but with few tangible gains. It's the same old story. Negro demands promises of action by white authorities, no action. While erratic racial policies and the illusion of progress may encourage ghetto violence, it is not safe to infer the institution of consistent representative policies is a useful permanent antidote to riots. Negro populations in conservative cities are, for the most part, disorganized and apathetic. They have been slow to develop race consciousness and militancy, but in ghettos of the cities such as Newark and Detroit, militancy is widespread and intense. Political reverses in Cincinnati and Newark were among the causes for the riots. Repression on a day to day basis could easily lead to retaliatory black terrorism. Up till now, white retaliation to riots for the most part has been the province of the police. But already there are forebodings of white citizens, particularly blue collar workers of ethnic origins, will again begin to play a collective role in the violence as they did in East St. Louis in 1917, Chicago in 1919, and Detroit in 1943. In the face of this possibility, civic minded business elites, such as in Dayton and Cincinnati, can be an important force for a moderation and positive sense of the term. Newark, Jersey City, and Milwaukee are three large cities in this study, most seriously polarized along racial lines. All three have sizable blue collar ethnic populations. Jersey City and Newark have substantial middle class of either race. Milwaukee's businessmen still exercise considerable influence in policy, but less so in the past. The political importance of the ethnic bloc is growing. Y'all still here? I want to do another chapter. In fact, I should stop because I think I've done 3 hours. I'll come back to this because I got some other things. unless y'all want me to go a few more minutes. I feel like going back um, to what's his face, to Kerner, but it's two something. I think we can pick this up later today. I do want to do this later today. I'm gonna come back and do. I'm wondering, should I do? Because I took the space out here. I'm wondering, should I do some of this to do more in 67? Mhm. Maybe I should do this. Do some of this. But then again, maybe I should not. I'm going to come back to what happened. But I'm going to do that later today. I will be on riots and militancy, and I'll be talking about racism. And I am going to come back and do some stuff on feminism. Let me stop because we've been at this for a while, for about 3 hours, more than three. I'm going to stop here. And hi, Deborah White, everybody. Let me stop for now. I'll come back and do this later today. Let me check out for now. And please share this. We're going to have much fun. I'm going to take a nap and I may get back up. I just want to do that and see what I can do. And I'll see. But let me stop right here for a second. I may do that book. I have this book on Jim Jones. I have some stuff on police violence. So, riots, police violence, all this stuff. We'll be talking about that. Let me stop for right now. I thank all the moderators, everybody. I'm going to stop for a second. We'll pick this back up. Okay, you guys behave yourselves. Thank you, everybody, in Twitter space. My God, there's 76 people there. So that means 96. So, wow, 99, 108 people. Okay, well, thank everybody. Let me stop for now. I'll pick this back up. I'll put some more stuff up on Twitter. We'll be talking about race. I think we're going to have a very difficult summer, people. And that's why I'm going to be looking at race, repression, police. We'll be talking about police brutality. And of course, I'm always going to talk about feminism. But I need to talk to you about these Nazis. So, and and I also want to talk about housing discrimination. And yeah, I'm tearing open this book I had. I think I may even look at that. This talks about restrictive covenant cases in the making of the civil rights movement. And I'm going to talk about how people in jail have impacted the movements. Let me clock out before I crash out. Although, yeah, let's come back to this, okay? So I'm going to stop for now. Y'all know where to find me. You know, this is Dr. Randy Short, Every Black Man's Book Club. And I'm going to be working to get this back to normal. We took a long break. I think I'm going to read that chapter on Black population from Everlasting Stain. So I'm going to be doing a mixture of new books, old books, sometimes a chapter, sometimes maybe I may read most of the work. Sinus is crazy. This pollen is a beast. You guys take care. I'm going to check out. Let me stop here. And let me stop with y'all here in Twitter. That's good. And I'll pick this up tomorrow. Counts. And stop over here. And then I'll stop this one here. Oh, great.